The security footage showed everything. A woman in blue scrubs being slammed face first into a linoleum floor while two guards pinned her arms behind her back. Her badge skittered across the tile. Her stethoscope snapped against her neck. People in the waiting room froze. A child started crying. Nobody moved to help her. That woman was Mara Voss, a trauma nurse with 11 years of spotless service, a Purple Heart she never talked about, and a flash drive in her pocket that contained enough evidence to bring down an entire hospital empire. Harlow Medical Center in Callaway, Colorado thought they were destroying a problem. They had no idea what they were waking up. If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. If you've been here before, you already know I don't do halfway. Follow along to the very end because this one goes places you won't see coming. If this story hits you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mara Voss was not this kind of person who made trouble. That was the first thing anyone who worked with her would tell you, if they were being honest. She showed up early, she stayed late. She didn't complain about the short staffing or the mandatory doubles, or the way the supply closets on the third floor were perpetually half empty, despite the inventory logs showing full stock. She learned quickly which battles were worth fighting and which ones would just eat you alive without changing anything. She had learned that lesson in a different country a long time ago, and it had cost her more than she liked to think about. Now she was here, Callaway, Colorado. A mid-sized city pressed between the Rockies and a sprawling network of highway interchanges, the kind of place where people moved to raise families and mostly stayed. Harlow Medical Center sat on the north edge of downtown, 12 stories of glass and steel with a fountain in the lobby and a motto etched above the entrance, "Healing with Integrity." Mara had walked under those words every single shift for 3 years. She stopped really reading them after the first 6 months. It wasn't that she hated the job, she loved the work, the real work, the part where a patient came in crashing and her hands just knew what to do before her brain finished the sentence. Trauma nursing was the only thing she'd found outside the military that gave her that same specific clarity, where everything else fell away, and there was only the problem in front of you and whatever you had to use to stop it. That kind of focus was hard to find in civilian life. Most days, it was the only reason she didn't question why she'd stayed in Callaway as long as she had. But Harlow wasn't a good hospital. It was a profitable one. There was a difference, and the longer Mara worked there, the more she understood exactly what that difference cost. Not in dollars, but in the quieter currencies. The patient who waited 4 hours with chest pain because the triage system had been quietly restructured to reduce bed turnover costs. The family that went home with discharge instructions that were technically accurate and practically useless. The small erosions, day after day, that nobody named out loud because naming them meant acknowledging them, and acknowledging them meant deciding what to do about it. Most people decided to do nothing. Mara understood that. She had come close to that decision herself, more than once. She shared the third-floor trauma wing with a rotating cast of nurses who were either exhausted, checked out, or quietly furious, sometimes all three at once, sometimes before their shift was even half over. The charge nurse on days was a woman named Petra Hollis, efficient and tight-lipped, who had worked at Harlow for 9 years and had long ago perfected the art of seeing nothing. Not because Petra was a bad person, Mara didn't think she was, but because seeing things at Harlow had consequences, and Petra had a mortgage and 2 kids in middle school and had made her calculations years ago. The attending physicians ranged from genuinely skilled to disturbingly absent, depending on the shift and the day of the week, and in at least 2 cases, whether they had a golf commitment that afternoon. And then there was the administration. Mara had her first real encounter with administration 8 months into her tenure, when a patient, a 63-year-old retired electrician named Donald Fitch, who came in with a cardiac event, was discharged 47 hours post-procedure with a billing statement that listed 3 procedures he hadn't received. Mara had been his nurse for both days. She had documented every intervention. She knew exactly what he'd received and what he hadn't. And the gap between those 2 things on his billing statement was not a small one. She flagged it to her supervisor, a mid-level manager named Greg Tully, who wore a Harlow lanyard and a smile that never quite moved above his cheekbones. "Billing errors happen," Tully told her, not looking up from his computer. "It gets reviewed. That's not a nursing concern." "He's going to get a bill for $22,000 in services that weren't performed," Mara said. Tully looked up then. The smile stayed exactly the same. I said, "It gets reviewed." She stood there for a moment, measuring whether there was anything else worth saying. There wasn't. Not to him. Not today. She could read a room. She had learned that particular skill in places where reading it wrong had immediate physical consequences. And even in the relatively low-stakes landscape of a hospital administrator's office, the instinct held. "Okay," she said. She let it go. She didn't want to. Something in her chest tightened every time she thought about Donald Fitch going home to open that envelope. But she had rent and a student loan that wasn't going anywhere, and she had learned what happened to people who pushed too hard too fast in places like this. They got pushed back, and the institution was always bigger, and you ended up on the outside with a reputation that followed you to your next application and the one after that. So she watched, and she waited, and she kept her head down and did her job better than anyone else on the floor, because that was the only currency she had that still felt clean. Just. The second incident happened 4 months later, and it was the one that started changing the calculation. A 19-year-old named Jamie Okafor came in after a car accident, not critical, thankfully, but she had a hairline fracture in her left wrist and a concussion that warranted monitoring overnight. Standard protocol, nothing dramatic. Mara pulled her chart mid-shift to review her evening medications and found something that didn't fit. An order for a drug that had no business being written for a concussion patient. The dosage was aggressive. The drug class was wrong for her presentation. It wasn't a subtle error. It was the kind of thing that, if you administered it and something went sideways, you would be answering questions about for a very long time. Mara flagged it immediately to the attending on duty, a Dr. Vance Riley, who had a reputation for being competent but not especially patient with nursing staff who second-guessed him. He demonstrated that reputation within about 30 seconds. "I think I know what I ordered, nurse," he said, with the particular inflection that was designed to end conversations rather than advance them. "I understand that," Mara said. "I just want to make sure we're aligned on her concussion protocol, because this order and the protocol don't match up." Riley looked at her the way some men look at things that are inconveniencing them. Not with anger exactly, but with a kind of dismissive impatience that was almost worse. "I'll review it," he said. Mara didn't fill the order. She documented her concern in the patient chart, wrote it clearly and specifically and with timestamps, and found Riley again 2 hours later to confirm that her documentation was on record and that the order had been reviewed. He had changed it by then, quietly, without acknowledgement, as if the original version had never existed. Jamie Okafor went home the next morning with her wrist in a brace and discharge instructions that were, this time, appropriate. She never knew anything had happened. That was the point, Mara supposed. That was what the work actually was, under the surface of it. But Greg Tully called Mara into his office the next morning, and the meeting was not a thank you. "I've heard from Dr. Riley," Tully said, settled back in his chair with the composed authority of a man who had never once had to perform a physical task under pressure. He felt that you were undermining his clinical authority in front of other staff. "There was one other nurse in the hall when we spoke," Mara said. "I wasn't making a public case out of it." "The concern is about pattern," Tully said. "This isn't the first time you've created friction with the medical staff." Mara thought about Donald Fitch, about the billing complaint she had brought to the same office and been dismissed from. She thought about how the word friction was doing a lot of heavy lifting in this conversation. "I prevented a medication error," she said. "The attending corrected his own order. After I flagged it." A pause. Tully's smile. "We're all on the same team here, Mara. I think it's important that everyone remembers that." She left his office and stood in the hallway for a long moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the distant sounds of the floor carrying on without her. Call bells. A cart rolling past, someone's low voice on a phone, the ordinary machinery of the place. She made a decision in that hallway that she didn't fully articulate even to herself until later. She was going to start paying much closer attention. It took her 4 more months to understand what she was actually looking at. The billing anomalies weren't random. That was the first thing she confirmed, and confirming it took longer than she would have liked, because she was doing it carefully, slowly, in the margins of her actual job, which still required her full attention 40-plus hours a week. She kept notes. Nothing that would get her in immediate trouble if someone found them, just personal records, dates, and patient ID numbers, and discrepancies she'd caught accidentally or been close enough to see. She wasn't looking for a grand conspiracy. She was a nurse, not an investigator. She was looking for a pattern, because patterns were something she understood. She found several, and they didn't reassure her. Medications listed as administered in patient charts that had never left the pharmacy according to the actual dispensing logs. She'd seen those logs twice, legitimately, as charge nurse, and the numbers didn't reconcile. Procedures billed at rates significantly above what had been documented in clinical notes. Patients who had been discharged with complications that were never coded as complications, which meant the complications didn't appear in the hospital's outcome reports, which meant the numbers Harlow presented to regulators and to the public looked meaningfully cleaner than the reality on the floor. She wasn't certain about all of it. Some of it she could only partially see, but the pieces she could see clearly enough were alarming. And then there was the supply room. She had worked 2 overnight shifts that month, covering for a colleague out sick. At 2 in the morning, she needed gauze from the secondary supply closet at the end of the 3rd floor hall, the one that was usually locked, which she had a key to because she functioned as charge nurse on nights when Petra wasn't there. She unlocked it, pulled the door open, and stopped. The shelves were mostly empty, not picked over or low, mostly empty in a way that suggested they had been that way for a while. The inventory log mounted to the outside of the door showed a full audit completed 6 days earlier, initialed by an administrator whose name she recognized, indicating full stock levels across every category on the list. Mara stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at the shelves, she looked at the log, she looked at the shelves again. Then she took out her phone and photographed both. The empty shelves, the audit log with its tidy signature and its confident numbers. She didn't know yet the full shape of what she was looking at, but she had spent years in environments where the gap between the official record and the physical reality was not an administrative error. It was a decision. And she had learned to treat that gap with a great deal of seriousness. The flash drive came together over the following 3 weeks, piece by piece. She moved carefully. She accessed only what she had legitimate reasons to access, and she documented those reasons as she went, because she had understood from the beginning, in the back of her mind, that if any of this ever came to anything, the how would matter as much as the what. The clearest moment, the one that shifted her from careful observation to active documentation, came from a stairwell. She was coming down from the 5th floor after visiting a patient who'd been transferred up from trauma, and the door above her hadn't latched completely behind the 2 men who'd entered from the 4th floor landing. She wasn't trying to listen. She heard them anyway. 2 voices she recognized from administrative meetings. One was a senior operations director named Colton Marsh, and the other she was fairly certain was Victor Hale, who ran Harlow's financial division and whose name she'd seen on the bottom of several billing-related memos. They were talking quietly but not whispering because they believed they were alone. She didn't hear everything. The stairwell acoustics were imperfect, and she kept moving because stopping would have made her presence obvious. But she heard 2 names she didn't recognize. She heard a dollar figure, $2.3 million, that had no context she could interpret as legitimate. And she heard the phrase patient outcome data used in a way that had nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with what regulators would and wouldn't see. She pushed through the door to the 3rd floor and stood in the hallway, very still, for about 4 seconds. Then she went back to her patients because she still had 6 hours left in her shift and the work didn't stop. But that evening, at home, she started compiling in earnest. Her notes, the photographs from the supply room, billing discrepancies she'd documented, partial records she'd accessed through legitimate channels, and the conclusions those records supported when you laid them next to each other. She was not a lawyer. She was not a federal investigator. She had never done anything like this before, and she was aware of her own limitations in a way that she tried to let inform her approach rather than paralyze it. What she had, when she looked at it assembled, was substantial, not complete, not airtight probably, in the way that would matter in a legal context. There were gaps, and she knew which ones they were. But what she had pointed clearly enough in one direction that she couldn't look at it and tell herself she was misreading it. Harlow Medical Center was defrauding patients and insurers at scale. Medications were being diverted. She was fairly certain to resale, though she couldn't prove the destination from what she had. Patient outcomes were being systematically falsified to maintain accreditation ratings that Harlow absolutely would not maintain under honest reporting. And at least 2 patient deaths in the past 18 months had documentation with inconsistencies serious enough that the word accidental felt like it required more scrutiny than anyone had given it. She put everything onto a flash drive. She made 2 copies and stored them separately, one with her attorney, eventually, and one in a location she wasn't going to write down anywhere. She kept the original in her scrub pocket while she was at work because she had decided that the safest place for it was somewhere she could feel it. And then she made a mistake, not a foolish one. She would not call it foolish even later when she could see clearly what it had cost her. She trusted someone she had calculated, with reasonable care, was trustworthy. A senior nurse named Dorcas Webb, who had worked at Harlow for 12 years and who had complained to Mara twice in the privacy of the break room about the way administration handled incident reports. Real complaints, specific ones, the kind that took some courage to say out loud, even quietly, even to one person. Mara showed her a portion of what she had. Not everything, enough to gauge her response. Dorcas went very still, looking at it. Then she said, "You need to be careful." "I know," Mara said. "I mean very careful, the way you're careful when something can actually hurt you." Mara looked at her. "I know what I have, Dorcas." Dorcas handed the papers back without touching anything she didn't have to. "Then you know they'll come for you." Mara thought she did know. She thought she'd prepared for it. She had not fully accounted for how fast it would happen, or how thoroughly, or for the fact that Dorcas Webb, who complained so specifically and so sincerely about administration in that break room, would walk directly to Greg Tully's office within 24 hours. 2 days after she showed Dorcas what she had, Greg Tully called her in. There was a woman from HR beside him this time, a Sandra Keel, according to her badge, with a pressed blazer and the professional warmth of someone who had practiced the expression. On the desk between them was a printed document that Mara could see the header of without leaning forward. "We've received a complaint," Tully said, "from a member of the nursing staff, regarding unauthorized access to administrative systems and potential theft of proprietary data." Mara looked at him, then at Sandra Keel, then at the document. "That's not accurate," she said. "The complaint specifies dates and system access logs," Sandra said, smooth and even. "We take data security very seriously here." "I'm sure you do," Mara kept her voice level. "I'd like to see the complaint in writing. That's not standard during preliminary review. I'd still like to see it." "That's not something we're able to do at this stage," Sandra said, in a tone that ended the sentence and expected that to be the end of the topic. The meeting lasted 14 more minutes, during which Mara said very little because she understood that nothing she said in this room would help her. At the end of it, she was informed that she was being placed on administrative leave pending investigation, that her systems access had been suspended effective immediately, and that she was expected to surrender her ID badge before leaving the building. She surrendered the badge. She did not surrender the flash drive. Walking through the lobby, she passed the fountain, the marble walls, the clean lines of the atrium that someone had spent a great deal of money designing to communicate trustworthiness. She passed under the motto one more time: healing with integrity. She pushed through the glass doors into the Colorado afternoon and thought, with a clarity that surprised her in its cleanness, "They know something exists. They don't know I made copies, and they've just made this official." The administrative leave lasted 11 days before it became something else entirely. She had hired an attorney on day 3, a woman named Carla Stein, who specialized in employment law with a particular focus on healthcare cases. Callaway had 2 major hospital systems, and Carla had, over 11 years of practice, developed an intimate familiarity with how both of them behaved when employees became inconvenient. She had the kind of reputation that institutions didn't enjoy, which meant she was exactly the right person. "Tell me everything," Carla said at their first meeting, and Mara did. Carla was quiet for a long time afterward, long enough that Mara started measuring the silence the way she measured things under pressure. "You have documentation supporting all of this," Carla said finally. "Not a question." "Yes." "Stored in multiple locations." "Yes." Carla nodded slowly, turning a pen over in her fingers. "They will come at you aggressively. I want you to understand that before we go any further, this is not going to be a situation where they see the strength of your position and back down. Institutions like Harlow escalate. The stronger your documentation, the harder they'll push back because the stakes are too high for them to absorb a loss quietly. I understand that. They'll move to discredit you professionally before you can discredit them legally. Your clinical record, your conduct, anything they can build a narrative around. Carla looked at her steadily. Is there anything in your history they could use? Mara thought about that honestly because the question deserved honesty. Nothing clinical. My record is clean. Professionally, nothing. Personally, I did 2 deployments overseas, one of them classified. There's a gap in my employment record from that period that I've never been able to fully explain without clearance issues. Carla made a note. Military background. Combat medic, attached to a specialized unit. For how long? 6 years total, 2 deployments. I separated honorably. Carla looked at her for a moment with an expression that Mara couldn't quite read. All right, she said. Here's what we do. They filed on Friday. Civil lawsuit, fraud, retaliation, defamation, and wrongful termination. Carla wanted speed, and Mara agreed with her reasoning. Every day they waited was a day Harlow had to build its narrative. And once the suit was filed, the story became harder to control. By Monday morning, Mara's name was on the local news. The segment was 3 minutes long and clearly built from information sourced inside Harlow. It referenced the ongoing internal investigation into alleged misconduct, raised the controlled substance concern in language vague enough to be deniable but specific enough to damage, and included a quote from a hospital spokesperson that used the phrase patient safety twice in 2 sentences without once specifying whose safety or what threat. Her phone rang before 8 in the morning. It rang again and again. She answered 2 calls. The first was her mother, from Tucson, whose voice had that particular careful steadiness that meant she was managing real fear. Mara talked her through it as best she could, kept her voice even, and promised to call again that evening. She would keep that promise. She had always been better at keeping promises than making them. The second call was from a 703 area code, Northern Virginia. She didn't know the number. She looked at it for 2 rings and then picked up. Is this Mara Voss? A man's voice, precise without being cold. Who's asking? My name is Roland Spears. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. A brief pause, as if he was choosing his next words with specific care. Your name came up in connection with a veterans protection filing from approximately 3 months ago, and some of what you've recently filed in civil court aligns with a matter our office has been tracking independently. Mara stood very still in the center of her apartment. Go ahead. Are you somewhere private? Yes. I'd like to ask you some questions, if you're willing to speak with me. She had made that call to the Veterans Advocacy line on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting in her car in her parking lot because she hadn't wanted to be inside when she made it. She'd been exhausted and frustrated and had been carrying the weight of what she was seeing at Harlow for long enough that it had started to feel physically heavy. She'd described what she was observing in general terms, careful not to name the hospital outright in that first call, careful to speak in the language of concern rather than accusation. She'd given her name because the line asked for it, and she wasn't going to lie. She had not expected a callback. She certainly had not expected one from the Department of Defense. I'm willing, she said. She talked to Roland Spears for 47 minutes. He asked precise questions, the kind of questions that told her he already had a framework and was testing where her information fit inside it. She answered carefully and fully because she was not going to come this far and be partial about it now. At the end of it, Spears said, "Don't discuss the substance of this call with anyone yet, including your attorney. Give me 72 hours. Why 72 hours? Because what you've documented may connect to a pattern that extends beyond Harlow Medical Center, he said. And if it does, how we proceed from here will matter significantly. Another pause. Can you do 72 hours? Yes, Mara said. After he hung up, she sat down at her kitchen table and stayed there for a while. The call had taken something she had been holding as a local problem and placed it inside a larger frame, and the dimensions of that larger frame were not entirely clear yet. Outside her window, Callaway was going about its morning. Traffic on the main road. A woman walking a dog across the street with the particular unhurried pace of someone with nowhere to be for an hour. The mountains in the distance where they always were, unchanged. She thought about Donald Fitch and his $22,000 bill. She thought about Jamie Okafor and the medication order that should never have been written. She thought about those supply room shelves, empty behind a door with a log that said otherwise, and whoever had signed their name to it without hesitation. She thought about Dorcas Webb in the break room saying they'll come for you, and then going to tell them exactly where to look. She had been in dangerous situations before. Not this kind, not with this particular shape, but the core of it. The part where the structure around you was hostile, the part where the resources on the other side were greater than yours, the part where walking away would be easier and staying was going to hurt. That part was not new. She knew what she did in situations like that. Her phone buzzed against the table. A text from a number she didn't recognize, no name attached, just a string of digits and 7 words beneath them. They put cameras on your car last night. Mara stared at the message for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the street below, at the Tuesday morning moving past in its ordinary way, and felt something settle into place inside her. Not calm, exactly, but the specific kind of readiness that comes when you stop waiting for something to happen and realize it already has. She picked up her phone and called Carla. "We need to meet today," she said when Carla answered on the second ring. "Not tomorrow, today." What happened? Mara looked at the text still open on her screen. Outside, the dog walker had turned the corner and disappeared. A city bus rolled past. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did. "I need you to know," Mara said quietly, "that whatever they told you this case was going to be, it just got a lot bigger." Carla met her at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the office. Neutral ground, Carla's idea, because Carla had already started thinking about the possibility that her own office phones were being monitored, and had decided not to dismiss that possibility out of hand. She arrived 7 minutes after Mara, which was unusual. Carla Stein was the kind of person who arrived first to everything, who treated punctuality as a form of professional respect. When she came through the door and sat down across from Mara without taking off her coat, Mara understood that something had already happened on Carla's end too. "Talk," Carla said. Mara put her phone on the table with the text message open. Carla read it once, looked up, read it again. "When did this come in?" "This morning, about 40 minutes before I called you." "You don't recognize the number?" "No, I ran it before I called you. It's a prepaid, unregistered." Carla sat back. She had a paper cup of coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched. "Someone inside Harlow?" "Or someone watching Harlow," Mara said. "I don't know which is better. Neither is particularly good." Carla was quiet for a moment, and Mara let her be quiet, because Carla's silences were where she did her best thinking. "Okay, cameras on your vehicle. That's illegal surveillance, potentially criminal depending on who ordered it and why. We document this, we preserve that message, and we do not go back to that parking spot." "I haven't left my apartment since I got the text." "Good. That stays good." Carla finally picked up her coffee. "Now tell me what else happened this morning, because that text was not the only thing in your voice when you called me." Mara told her about Roland Spears. Not everything. She had promised Spears 72 hours, and she was going to keep that, but she gave Carla enough of the shape of it to matter. Carla listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Mara respected most about her. "Department of Defense Inspector General," Carla said when Mara finished. "Yes." "And he asked you not to tell me." "He asked me not to discuss the substance of it. I'm not giving you the substance. I'm telling you the call happened." Carla looked at her for a long moment with an expression that walked a careful line between professional displeasure and grudging approval. 72 hours, she said. "That's what he asked for." "Fine." Carla set down her cup. "In the meantime, we have a hearing on Friday for Harlow's motion to dismiss, which I intend to oppose completely and which I am now more motivated to oppose than I was yesterday, because whoever is running their operation is getting sloppy. Surveilling a plaintiff during active litigation is exactly the kind of thing that tends to interest judges. If we can prove it. That's why you're going to send me that text message right now, and then put your phone in a Faraday bag until further notice." Carla pulled a small metallic pouch from her bag and slid it across the table. "I had a feeling we were going to need these." Mara looked at the bag. "You just had one of these in your bag." "I had 2, Carla said without particular inflection. "I'm keeping the other one." The 72 hours passed. Roland Spears called back on hour 71. He did not give her much. He was careful about what he said on a phone call, and she understood why. But what he did give her was this. The matter Harlow connected to was larger than she had known, and it involved at least 2 other medical facilities in the region, And the investigation had been active for 14 months before her veterans protection filing had landed on his desk and given them a thread they hadn't had before. "You're a material witness," he said. "Potentially more than that. I can't tell you more right now, but I need you to understand that what you're holding, the documentation, is now part of a federal matter, which means you need to be very careful about who knows you have it and where it's stored." "I've been careful," she said. "Be more careful," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was the tone of someone giving a genuine warning rather than a bureaucratic one. "And Mara, don't go anywhere alone if you can help it. We're moving as fast as we can on our end, but until we can move publicly, you're exposed." She told Carla the substance of it after that call. Carla sat with it, and then she did something Mara hadn't expected. She looked genuinely, quietly furious. Not at Mara, at the situation. 14 months, Carla said. That's what he said. They've been building this for 14 months, which means whatever is inside that hospital goes well past what you found. She was thinking out loud now, something she did sometimes when the pieces were coming in faster than her professional composure could fully manage. The question is whether that helps us or complicates us. Both, probably, Mara said. Both, Carla agreed. Definitely both. That's it. She moved out of her apartment 4 days later. It wasn't a panicked decision. She'd been thinking about it since the text about the cameras, and she'd discussed it with Carla, who agreed that maintaining a predictable location was a liability. She didn't have family in Callaway. She had 2 people she considered real friends in the city, both of them nurses from her unit, and she wasn't going to put either of them in the position of knowing where she was. She stayed at a motel outside the city limits, paid cash, used her middle name at the desk, which the clerk didn't question because it was that kind of motel. The room smelled like industrial cleaner, and the heater made a sound every 40 minutes, like something trying to escape from inside the wall. She slept badly the first 2 nights and adequately after that. She had slept in worse places. She had slept in places where sleeping badly was the correct survival response. During the day, she worked at Carla's office, in a small conference room they'd cleared for her, going through documents and preparing for the Friday hearing. The work was tedious in a specific way that she found manageable, detailed, methodical, requiring attention without requiring the kind of sustained emotional engagement that would have broken her down. She was good at compartmentalizing. It was one of the useful things her years in service had given her, and one of the things therapists, when she'd seen them, tended to describe with cautious ambivalence. The Friday hearing did not go well for Harlow. It did not go catastrophically. The motion to dismiss was argued by a Harlow attorney named Burridge, who was clearly skilled and had clearly been briefed by someone who understood the litigation landscape. But Carla was better, and more importantly, Carla had filed supporting documentation the night before that Burridge clearly hadn't fully anticipated, and the judge, a woman named Honorée Paton, who had the demeanor of someone who had been hearing cases long enough to recognize when an institution was trying to run a procedural clock, asked several questions during the hearing that suggested she was not inclined to clear the way for Harlow easily. "Motion denied," Judge Patton said, at the end of 90 minutes. "We proceed to discovery." Mara was seated in the gallery. She didn't let herself react visibly because the hearing wasn't over and the courtroom wasn't the right place, and also because she had learned a long time ago that the moments that feel like victories sometimes aren't, and the moments that feel like defeats sometimes aren't either. And the only thing that was ever certain was what you did next. But in the parking lot afterward, Carla let out a breath that was very close to a laugh. "Discovery," she said. They did not want discovery. What does discovery mean for them? It means we get to ask them for documents, formally, under oath obligations, which means if they've destroyed anything, that destruction becomes its own legal problem. Carla unlocked her car. "It means we're actually in this now." Mara nodded. Good. She meant it. She was tired of the preliminary maneuvering, tired of the waiting, tired of living in a motel room under her middle name while the institution that had done this to her went about its business in a 12-story glass building with a fountain in the lobby. She wanted to be in it. She wanted the process to move. What she did not account for was how Harlow would respond to losing the motion. She found out 8 days later on a Wednesday evening when she walked to her car in the parking garage 2 blocks from Carla's office. She had broken her own protocol. That was the honest accounting of it, and she made herself be honest about it because the alternative was to tell a more comfortable version that absolved her and that version would not help her the next time. She had been working late. The garage was one she'd used a dozen times, and she had gone alone because the paralegal who usually walked with her had left early for a family thing, and she had decided that this one time, the precaution was probably excessive. It was not excessive. There were two of them. She registered them in the peripheral way she registered most things in enclosed spaces. A trained response, automatic. Nothing she had to consciously initiate. Two men, positioning that wasn't accidental, and the specific kind of stillness that meant they were waiting for something rather than going somewhere. They were waiting for her. The first one spoke. He was heavy-set, mid-40s, wearing clothes that were designed to look ordinary. "You should have stayed home," he said, and his voice had the flat effect of someone who had said things like this before, to other people, in other parking garages. "You're making a mistake," Mara said. She was not being dramatic. She was giving them genuine information, and she meant it the way she said it. Not as a threat, not as bravado, just as a statement of fact that she was willing to put on record before whatever happened next. The second man moved first. What happened in the following 45 seconds was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looks controlled when it's over. She took a hit to the left side of her face that she didn't fully avoid because she was dealing with the other one simultaneously, and she went down on one knee on the concrete, and she felt the gravel open the skin on her palm, and none of it was acceptable. But she had trained in situations where the opponent had a size advantage and a willingness to be brutal, and the training was not the kind that asked you to be graceful. It was the kind that asked you to still be standing. She was standing when it was over. They were not. She stood in the parking garage with blood on her face and both hands shaking slightly. Adrenaline, the body's honest response to what had just happened. Nothing she could prevent. And she looked at the two men on the ground and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was not going to be something Harlow could easily explain. She took out her phone and called Carla. "I need you to call the police," she said. "I'm in the Elmwood parking structure on 5th. I've been attacked." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "Yes. Not critically." She touched her face. Her hand came away red. "But Carla, they need to be here before these two wake up. I need witnesses on the scene before anyone can manage this." "I'm calling now," Carla said. "Don't move." She didn't move. The police arrived in 9 minutes. Carla arrived in 14. The two men on the ground were both conscious by then, which Mara had mixed feelings about, but she understood that it was better for the record that they were able to give statements, because their statements were going to be very difficult to square with the security camera mounted on the east wall of the garage that had been recording the whole time. She gave her statement to a Detective Ruiz who was professional and thorough and who asked her 3 times, in 3 different ways, whether she was certain about the sequence of events. She was certain. She told him the same thing each time, in the same order, because the events had happened in a specific order and she had a clear memory of it. One of the men was carrying a phone. On the phone, when Detective Ruiz's partner scrolled through it in her presence, was a text thread with a number that Ruiz flagged immediately and wouldn't explain to her, but whose expression changed when he saw it. "We're going to need you to come in tomorrow morning," Ruiz said. "I'll be there," Mara said. She went to an urgent care clinic that evening, alone because she told Carla she was fine, and Carla didn't fully believe her but respected the request. The cut on her face required 4 stitches. The palm was cleaned and dressed. She had a bruised rib. She knew it before the nurse told her, could feel it with every breath. That was going to make sleeping interesting for the next few weeks. She sat in the urgent care waiting room after, holding a cold pack to her face, and she thought about what the text thread on that man's phone might contain, and who the number at the other end of it belonged to. She thought she had a reasonable guess. The news broke 2 days later, and it broke sideways. Not the story Mara had been building toward. Not the fraud. Not the falsified records. Not any of the things she had documented. What broke was the attack in the parking garage, because 2 men had been arrested, and one of them had, under what she understood to be some fairly direct questioning, indicated that they had been contracted by a third party. The name of that third party was not released publicly, but the story itself, nurse attacked during hospital lawsuit, was on 3 news sites by Thursday morning. The comment sections were, as comment sections tend to be, a mixed landscape, but the ratio was different from the first story. The first story had positioned her as a problem employee with misconduct allegations. This one positioned her as a woman who had been physically assaulted while a lawsuit against her former employer was pending, and that framing was harder to spin, even for people who were paid to spin things. Her phone rang from numbers she didn't recognize. She didn't answer most of them. She answered the one from Roland Spears. "I saw the news," he said. "Yes." "Are you all right?" "Functional?" She was sitting in the motel room with her laptop open and the curtains drawn, the bad heater cycling through its 40-minute rhythm. "It accelerated something on your end?" "It confirmed something," he said. "There's a connection between the men who were arrested and a financial entity that we've been tracking as part of the broader investigation. It's the link we needed to establish a direct line between what happened to you and the administrative level of Harlow's operation." Mara processed that. "So the attack wasn't freelance?" "No, it was not." She looked at the wall. Outside, the parking lot of the motel was quiet. A few cars, a semi-idling at the far end, the particular stillness of an out-of-the-way place in the middle of the afternoon. "How much longer?" she asked. "We're working as fast as we can," Spears said. "I know that's not the answer you want." "It isn't," she agreed, "but I'll take the honest version." After the call, she tried to eat something and mostly succeeded. She checked her phone out of habit and found 3 texts from her mother. Each one a variation on "please call me when you can," with increasing urgency. She called her mother back and talked for 20 minutes, keeping her voice steady, doing the thing she had always done, which was to manage her mother's fear without dismissing it or collapsing into it. Her mother was not easily fooled, but she was willing to accept steadiness as a substitute for certainty when the alternative was worse. "Come home," her mother said, near the end of the call. "I can't." "Mara." "I know, I can't." She paused. "Not yet." There was a silence on the line, the kind between two people who know each other well enough to say things without saying them. Then her mother said, "You're the most stubborn person I've ever known." "You told me that was a good thing," Mara said. "I was talking about other situations. Most of them were similar to this one." Her mother made a sound that was half exasperation and half something else, something softer, that Mara didn't have a word for. They said goodnight. Mara set down the phone and sat in the silence for a moment, the motel room ordinary and temporary around her, and let herself feel the weight of it. Not the fear, which she had put somewhere useful, but the tiredness. The specific tiredness of being in a situation that required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, the constant low-level expenditure of energy that left no margin for anything else. She allowed herself 2 minutes of that. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. The nursing board hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. She had known it was coming. The controlled substance allegation that Harlow had added to their complaint had triggered an automatic review by the state nursing board. That was how the process worked, and Harlow had known it was how the process worked, which was exactly why they had added the allegation. It was a specific kind of weapon, chosen for its precision. A nursing license was not just a professional credential. It was an identity, in the way that the things you spend years earning and building your life around become part of who you are. Carla accompanied her to the hearing. They walked in together on a Monday morning, and Mara wore the same composure she had worn to every hard thing she'd walked into. Not performed, not brittle, just present. The board consisted of 5 members, 3 nursing professionals and 2 administrative representatives. The chair was a woman named Dr. Sylvia Park, who had the precise manner of someone who had run a great many of these hearings and found that most of them resolved more clearly than the initial complaint suggested they would. The Harlow representative, a different attorney today, younger, with a prepared presentation that included printed exhibits, laid out the allegation in detail. The controlled substances in question were specific: 2 medications from the pharmacy, documented missing, with access logs that placed Mara in proximity to the pharmacy during the relevant window. Carla responded methodically. She entered Mara's complete clinical record: 11 years, no disciplinary actions, a series of commendations from facilities prior to Harlow. She entered documentation of the retaliation timeline, showing the escalating pattern from Tully's first meeting to the termination to the lawsuit. She entered the police report from the parking garage attack, which she framed not as proof of anything specific in this hearing, but as context for the board to consider when evaluating the credibility of allegations coming from Harlow during active litigation. And then she entered something Mara hadn't known about until 30 minutes before the hearing. It was a statement from a pharmacist named Wendell Groff, who had worked at Harlow for 6 years and had, 3 weeks earlier, contacted a healthcare whistleblower hotline and given a detailed account of a medication diversion scheme that had been running inside Harlow's pharmacy for at least 2 years. The missing medications that Harlow had attributed to Mara appeared in Groff's account, attributed not to any nurse, but to a systematic process that bypassed standard dispensing protocols entirely. Mara read it in the hallway before they went in, and her hands were steady, but her mind was doing something complicated, because she had not known about Wendell Groff. She had not known there was a pharmacist who had seen what she'd suspected and named it. And the fact that someone else inside that building had been carrying the same weight and had eventually put it down somewhere it could be seen, hit her in a way she hadn't expected. The board took a recess after Carla presented the Groff statement. They came back 45 minutes later. The board finds insufficient grounds to proceed with formal action on the controlled substance allegation at this time, Dr. Park said. The license of Mara Voss remains active pending the outcome of the broader litigation. We are, however, referring several elements of today's hearing to the State Health Department for independent review. Outside on the steps, Mara stood in the November air, and Carla stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Wendell Groff," Mara said finally. "He contacted us last week," Carla said. "I wasn't sure he'd follow through until he did." "You should have told me." "I know. I didn't want to build on it until I knew it was solid." Mara looked out at the parking lot, the ordinary midday traffic, a woman loading groceries into her car 3 rows back with a toddler balanced on her hip. The mundane persistence of a regular Tuesday in a city that didn't know what was happening inside its own institutions. "The license," Mara said. "They almost got it." "They didn't get it. Almost is closer than I'd like." Carla was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." They walked to Carla's car. Mara's face was still slightly swollen on the left side. The bruising had gone from red to that specific shade of purple-yellow that meant healing but hadn't finished the process. She had stopped bothering to cover it. There was something clarifying about walking around with visible evidence of what had been done to her. It made it harder for anyone, including herself, to pretend the situation was abstract. She had a voicemail from Roland Spears waiting when she got back to the motel. She played it standing in the parking lot because she didn't want to hear it in the room with its bad light and its noise and its walls that felt temporarily closer every time she was inside too long. The message was 42 seconds long. Spears sounded unhurried, which she had come to understand was his baseline, but there was something in the cadence that was different from his previous messages. A specificity, maybe. A sense of trajectory. "We're moving into the final phase of our process. I can't give you a date because we don't operate on announced timelines, but I need you to be prepared for things to shift quickly when they shift. Don't make any decisions about your situation that would be hard to reverse in the next 30 days. Keep your attorney close. And if you get any communication that seems to be from our office but doesn't come through the number you have for me, don't respond to it without calling me first." She played it twice. Then she called Carla and read it to her from memory, because she had a good memory for spoken things, had trained it to be good, and this was not a message she was going to trust to a voicemail she didn't control. Carla was quiet on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Final phase? That's the language he used?" "Yes." 30 days. That's what he said. Another silence. The parking lot was cold. Her breath made small clouds in the air. "Mara," Carla said, "I need you to understand something. Whatever is coming, when it comes, it's going to move fast, and there are going to be people who try to get in front of it. People from Harlow, from their legal team, maybe from the board. They may come to you with offers, settlements, or other things. They may try to reach you directly without going through me. They may say things that are designed to make you feel like settling quickly is safer than waiting." Carla paused. "Do not engage with any of it without me. Not a word." "I know," Mara said. "I need you to actually know, not just say it." "Carla," Mara's voice was even. "I walked into a hospital every day for 3 years knowing something was wrong, and waited until I was certain before I moved. I moved out of my apartment to stay in a motel under a different name. I sat in a parking garage with blood on my face and gave a complete and accurate statement to the police." She paused. "I know." A beat of silence and then something that was almost a laugh. "Fair point," Carla said. Mara went inside. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room with its industrial cleaner smell and its noisy heater. And she held the phone in both hands and thought about 30 days. 30 days was not a long time in most measures. She had been patient for much longer than that. She had spent months building something piece by piece, carrying it quietly, and she could carry it for 30 more days. She opened her laptop and found Wendell Groff's public professional profile. His name was in the board documents, which were public record. And she looked at his photograph for a moment, a middle-aged man with a kind face and tired eyes. She had never met him. She didn't know what it had cost him to make that call to the hotline. She imagined it had cost something significant, because everything worthwhile seemed to. She thought, he saw the same thing I saw, and he didn't look away either. She closed the laptop. Outside the motel window, the sky had gone dark in the way it went dark in Colorado in November. Fast, total, the mountains disappearing into it so completely that by 7 o'clock you had to take on faith that they were still there. Her phone buzzed. Not a call this time. A news alert from a local outlet she'd set up a notification for, one of 3 she was tracking. The headline read, "Harlow Medical Center CEO. Colton Marsh cancels scheduled investor presentation. Citing internal review. No details provided." She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly. Colton Marsh. The name from the stairwell. The voice she'd recognized, the one talking about patient outcome data in a way that had nothing to do with patients. Internal review. She understood what that meant, in the language of institutions trying to manage something before it managed them. She understood that the people at the top of Harlow were no longer fully in control of their own timeline, that something had shifted in the balance of pressure, and that the next move would come from a direction they were not expecting. She set the phone down on the bedside table. The heater knocked in its 40-minute cycle. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing, staring at the ceiling in the dark, and for the first time in weeks, she did not feel like she was waiting. She felt like something was already in motion. Something being in motion and something arriving were 2 different things, and the distance between them turned out to be 3 weeks of a particular kind of waiting that Mara found harder than the earlier kind. The earlier waiting had been active. She'd been building, documenting, compiling, always with something to do with her hands and her attention. This waiting had a different texture. The documentation was complete. The lawsuit was filed. The nursing board had held. The federal machinery was turning somewhere she couldn't see, at a pace she couldn't influence. And her role had shifted from the person driving the situation to the person the situation was happening around. She did not handle that shift especially well, and she knew it. She started running again. She'd stopped when she moved out of the apartment, because running required routes, and routes required predictability, and predictability had felt like a liability. But the motel was far enough outside the city that the roads around it were empty at 5 in the morning, and the risk calculation had shifted enough that she allowed herself an hour before dawn. Just pavement and cold air, and the mountains beginning to separate themselves from the dark sky as the light came up. It didn't fix anything. It made her easier to be around, which was its own category of useful. Carla called every other day with procedural updates that were real but incremental. Discovery requests had gone out to Harlow. Harlow's attorneys had responded with what Carla described with clinical precision as a document dump designed to obscure rather than illuminate. 4,700 pages of largely irrelevant materials delivered on a Friday afternoon with a cover letter citing full compliance. Carla had 2 paralegals going through it page by page. She was not deterred. She was, if anything, energized by it, because in her experience, the size of an institution's obstruction was directly proportional to the size of what it was trying to protect. "They're scared," Carla told her, on a Tuesday call. "They should be," Mara said. "I want you to stay exactly that calm when we're in the courtroom." "I'm always calm in consequential situations. It's the inconsequential ones that get me." Carla laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind that surprised itself. "I believe that completely," she said. Spears called once on day 19. The The call lasted 6 minutes. He told her the federal timeline had compressed. He told her to expect contact from him within the week. He told her that when things began to move, they would move faster than she expected, and she should have Carla reachable at all hours. "I need to ask you something," Mara said before he hung up. "Go ahead." "When this breaks, the federal part of it, what happens to Wendell Groff?" A brief pause. "He's a cooperating witness. He has protections in place." "That's not what I asked." Another pause, longer. "He's going to have a difficult period," Spears said. "His name will be public. That comes with costs. But he made the decision with full information." "Okay," Mara said. She sat with that after the call. Wendell Groff, the pharmacist with the tired eyes, who had seen the same thing she'd seen and had eventually stopped carrying it alone. The costs he would pay were going to be real and unglamorous, and would not make the news the way the executive's arrests would. That was how it worked. She knew that was how it worked and still found something corrosive in knowing it. She wrote him a letter. Handwritten, because handwritten things were harder to intercept and easier to mean. She sent it to his professional address, which was still listed because he was, as far as anyone knew publicly, still employed at Harlow. His cooperation had been quiet, as cooperations needed to be. The letter was short. She thanked him for what he'd done without specifying what she knew he'd done. She told him that the specific kind of courage required to name true things inside institutions that needed them to stay unnamed was something she understood firsthand. She sealed the envelope and mailed it on a Wednesday morning and did not think about whether it would reach him in time, because she had no control over that and had learned to conserve energy by not expending it on things she had no control over. She didn't always succeed at that, but she tried. The call from Spears came on day 26 at 6:47 in the morning. "Today," he said. "Federal agents are executing warrants at Harlow Medical Center beginning at 8 a.m. The U.S. Attorney's Office is holding a press conference at noon. Your civil case is directly referenced in the federal complaint. Your name will be public by midday." Mara was already dressed. She had been awake since 5. Some part of her had known, or something close to known. She had slept lightly for the past 3 nights in a way that felt less like anxiety and more like anticipation, the body's preparation for something it understood was coming before the mind had confirmed it. "Understood," she said. "Is your attorney reachable?" "She's been on standby since last night." A brief pause. Not hesitation, just the space between one sentence and the next for a man who chose his words precisely. "Mara, what you did, documenting what you documented, making the call you made, holding the line when they came at you the way they did, that mattered. It gave us what we needed to connect the pieces." "I know," she said. "I didn't do it so it would matter in a federal case. I did it because patients were being harmed." "I know that too," Spears said. "That's exactly why it worked." She called Carla the moment she hung up. Carla answered on the first ring. "Today," Mara said. "I heard. I got a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office 20 minutes ago. They want us in." A pause, and then something in Carla's voice shifted into a register Mara hadn't heard from her before. Not unprofessional, but real. "How are you doing?" Mara looked around the motel room. The bad light. The heater, quiet for once in its temperamental cycle. The mountains visible through the gap in the curtains in the early morning, solid and permanent. "Ask me at the end of the day," she said. She did not go to Harlow. She wanted to. There was a part of her, the part that had spent months being systematically dismantled by that building and the people who ran it, that wanted to stand across the street and watch the federal vehicles in the parking lot and see the logo above the entrance and know what was happening on the other side of the glass. But Carla had counseled against it, and Carla was right. And Mara had enough discipline to follow the right advice, even when it cost her something. Instead, she and Carla went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where they spent 2 hours with a team of federal prosecutors who were thorough and well-prepared and operating at a level of institutional momentum that had clearly been building for a very long time. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Dana Frick, who had close-cropped hair and a methodical way of speaking that reminded Mara of the best officers she'd served under, people who moved efficiently and wasted nothing. Frick walked them through the broad outlines of what the federal complaint contained. Racketeering charges against Harlow Medical Center as an organization, wire fraud, healthcare fraud, obstruction of justice, and attached to specific individuals, conspiracy to commit assault. Mara looked at that last one when Frick set the document on the table. The two men from the parking garage, she said. Their phones produced enough to establish a direct chain, Frick said. The contracting went through a third-party security consulting firm. The authorization trail leads to Harlow's COO. Colton Marsh, Mara said. Frick looked at her steadily. You knew. I heard his voice in a stairwell 14 months ago. I didn't know how far it went, but I knew it was him. Frick made a note. Small, specific, the kind that suggested she was writing down something she expected to use. We'll need a formal statement from you on that conversation, as much detail as you can provide. I can provide a lot of detail, Mara said. Good. The noon press conference played on the office television. Someone had the volume low, but the visuals were sufficient. The U.S. attorney stood at a podium and spoke for 12 minutes about accountability and the integrity of the healthcare system. Mara watched the ticker running across the bottom of the screen and saw her name appear there in small white letters and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not vindication. That was too clean and too simple for what she actually felt. Something more complicated. Something that acknowledged that the ticker and the press conference and the federal charges were real and significant and were also not the point. They were the consequence of the point, which had been Donald Fitch and his billing statement, and Jamie Okafor and the medication order that should never have been written, and the supply room shelves that shouldn't have been empty, and the two patients whose deaths had inconsistencies she had not been able to stop thinking about for over a year. You okay? Carla said quietly beside her. Working on it, Mara said. The arrests were not simultaneous, which Mara learned later was deliberate. Victor Hale, the financial director, was taken from his office at Harlow at 8:23 in the morning. Colton Marsh was not at the hospital. He had not been there since the canceled investor presentation 3 weeks earlier, during which time he had, according to what Carla began receiving from sources by early afternoon, been attempting to liquidate assets and make arrangements that federal agents had been watching with considerable patience. He was apprehended at Denver International Airport at 10:41, carrying a carry-on bag and a one-way ticket that would ultimately have landed him in a country without an extradition treaty. The agents who stopped him were not dramatic about it. He sat down when they asked him to. That was the thing about people like Marsh, Mara thought. When she heard the detail later, they were often very compliant when the structure they had operated inside was visibly no longer functioning in their favor. 4 other Harlow executives were arrested over the course of the day. A board member who had signed off on falsified outcome reports. The administrator whose name was on the supply room inventory log. 2 people from the billing department whose involvement ran deeper than their titles suggested. Greg Tully was questioned but not immediately charged. His attorney arrived before the agents finished with him, and the picture of his involvement was, as of that evening, still being assembled. Mara heard all of this in pieces, over the course of the longest day she could remember in a long time. She and Carla were at the federal building until mid-afternoon, then at Carla's office until early evening, going through the implications for the civil case. The primary defense was that you were a disgruntled employee fabricating allegations, Carla said, her jacket draped over the back of her chair. That defense now requires them to argue that the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, a federal grand jury, and a cooperating pharmacist are all part of the same fabrication. That's a difficult argument, Mara said. Mathematically impossible is the technical term. Carla looked at her. We're going to win this case. I've believed that for a while. But today it stopped being a professional assessment and became a certainty. Mara nodded. I want to go home, she said. Not to Tucson, to her apartment, her own bed, her own kitchen, the view from her living room window she hadn't seen in nearly 6 weeks. I'll have someone check the building first, Carla said. I know. Tomorrow? Yes, Mara said. Tomorrow. She was back in her apartment by noon the next day. It smelled slightly stale, the way closed spaces did, and there was a substantial pile of mail inside the door. And there was one moment, standing in her kitchen with a cup of bad coffee, when she felt the full weight of everything that had happened between the last time she'd stood there and now. All of it landing without the buffer of urgency that had kept it manageable. She stood there and let it land, because there was no useful alternative. It lasted about 4 minutes. Then she opened the window and the Colorado air came in, cold and direct, and she finished the coffee and started sorting the mail. The days that followed had the strange quality of aftermath. The crisis had broken publicly, the federal case was generating consistent news coverage, and the civil lawsuit had shifted from a contested battle into something Harlow's remaining legal team was approaching with the posture of people managing losses rather than fighting for wins. Carla described their most recent filing as the legal equivalent of a white flag with fine print. Mara went to Carla's office daily. She gave the formal statement that Frick had requested. 2 sessions, 4 hours total, every detail in the methodical chronological order she had been organizing in her own mind for more than a year. Frick listened with the focused attention of someone who was not just building a case but understanding a story. At the end of the second session, she said, "You kept exceptional records." "I had good training," Mara said. "Military?" Partly just understanding that the only thing protecting a true account is the quality of its documentation. Frick looked at her for a moment. "What branch?" "Army. Combat medic." A nod, and something in the quality of the nod that registered without making a production of it. The civil pretrial conference was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Harlow's team had filed a motion for continuance. More time, they said, given the complexity of the parallel federal proceedings. Carla opposed it. Judge Patton denied it. The conference would proceed. Mara was sleeping in her own bed, running her usual route, eating at regular hours. The rib had healed to the point where she noticed it only on cold mornings. The scar from the parking garage was fading to a thin line. She was, on the surface of things, functioning. Underneath that surface, she was still carrying something she didn't have a word for. Not unresolved fear because the immediate danger had passed, and not grief exactly, though grief was in there somewhere. More like the residue of sustained high-stakes attention, the particular fatigue that comes from spending months in a situation where the cost of a single misstep would have been total. She called her mother every other evening. She let herself spend time with the 2 colleagues who had reached out after the news broke. One brought dinner twice, unannounced, which Mara found she didn't object to. She had been alone inside this for a very long time, and the company of people who were angry on her behalf, without needing anything from her in return, turned out to matter more than she'd expected. She thought about her patients, specifically. Donald Fitch, who she found in public records, and who appeared, from what she could determine, to still be living in Callaway. Jamie Okafor, who she couldn't trace, which she decided to interpret as the absence of bad news. The 2 patients whose deaths had documentation inconsistencies. They were in the federal complaint, anonymized but present. She knew which patients they were. She had thought about them at odd intervals for more than a year, and she thought about them now with something that was not quite peace, but was closer to it than she'd been able to get before. The pretrial conference was on a Thursday morning. Mara dressed without performing anything, just choosing to show up the way she intended to show up, which was fully. The bruising was gone. She had slept well. She ate breakfast sitting at her own table with the window open, not looking at her phone, which was something she had not managed in most of the preceding 6 months. Judge Patton ran the conference with efficiency. Across the table, Harlow was represented by Everett Soames, a senior attorney who had taken over from Burridge after the arrests. Burridge had, as Carla put it, developed a persistent scheduling conflict. Soames was careful and operating with the contained manner of a man who is managing expectations rather than advancing a position. 40 minutes in, he said, "Your Honor, my client wishes to explore the possibility of resolution prior to trial." Patton looked at Carla. "Counsel?" "We're willing to discuss terms," Carla said. "Any resolution requires full monetary compensation, restoration of Ms. Voss's professional record, and a public acknowledgement by Harlow Medical Center of the conduct that gave rise to this litigation." Soames' expression moved slightly. "The public acknowledgement component, non-negotiable," Carla said. Judge Patton looked between them with the calm of someone who had seen this exchange in various forms many times and found it predictable but not uninteresting. "I'll schedule a settlement conference for 2 weeks out. Both parties should arrive with authority to make binding commitments." She closed her folder. "I don't need to tell you that any resolution appearing to minimize the conduct at issue will receive careful scrutiny from this bench." "Understood," Carla said. Understood, Soames said with less certainty. On the courthouse steps, Carla said, "They're going to settle." "I know. It'll be real money, the public acknowledgement. They'll fight that. But we're going to get it." Mara looked out at the street, Callaway in the midday light, people going about their Thursday. "How long?" "Weeks. They don't have leverage to drag it out anymore. Every day it's pending is another day it's in the news." Carla looked at her. "You should be very clear with yourself about what you want this to look like. We're close enough now that it matters." Mara thought about that concretely, not abstractly. What she wanted. She wanted the defrauded patients to know they hadn't been imagining what had been done to them. She wanted the 2 people who had died with falsified records to be named in something official. She wanted the nursing license that had nearly been stripped from her to be on record as having been wrongly threatened. She wanted the public acknowledgement not only for herself, but because institutions allowed to harm people quietly were the ones that did it again. And she wanted to go back to work. She wanted a trauma bay, and a patient who needed her full attention and the specific clarity that came with it. The thing she had loved about this work before everything else had happened, and still loved now, underneath all of it. "I want it done right," she said. "Whatever that takes." "That's what we're going to do," Carla said. The 2 weeks before the settlement conference had the quality of a long, careful exhale. Mara returned her attention to the nursing license reactivation process. The forms, the documentation submissions, the procedural steps that were unglamorous but necessary. She also heard from Spears once more during that period, a brief call to tell her that a grand jury had returned additional indictments expanding charges against 3 of the already arrested individuals. She thanked him. He said she'd done good work. She told him she'd done necessary work, and that the distinction mattered to her. "Fair point," he said. She thought about that phrase. 2 people had said it to her now, in the same tone, responding to the same kind of correction. She wondered what it said about her that the correction was automatic. Probably nothing she didn't already know. The night before the settlement conference, she sat at her kitchen table without working, just sitting in her apartment in the quiet. 5 months. It had been 5 months since Greg Tully had asked for her badge, and she had walked out of Harlow's lobby into the afternoon and understood clearly that she was not going to back down from what she knew. Her phone lit up, a text from Wendell Groff's number. He had reached out briefly once before, after the federal charges went public, a short and careful message she had kept. "Heard about tomorrow. Thinking of you." She looked at it for a moment, the pharmacist with the tired eyes who had seen what she had seen and had eventually stopped carrying it alone. She typed back, "Thank you. Same to you." She put the phone down. She did not open her laptop. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and let herself be in it, without urgency, without the constant low-level expenditure of vigilance that had become so habitual over the past months that she had stopped registering it as effort. She went to bed. She slept 7 hours without waking. The settlement conference began at 9 in the morning in a downtown conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. Soames was there with 2 associates, Carla with 1. Mara sat at the table and did not bring a notepad because she was not there to take notes. She was there to be present and to make sure the people across the table understood, in whatever register they were capable of, that she was not going to disappear. The first 2 hours were procedural: numbers, frameworks, language. Carla handled most of it with the focused precision of someone who had thought about every angle of this for months. Soames pushed back on the damages figure. Carla produced documentation. He pushed back on the public acknowledgement language. Carla produced more documentation and then looked at him with an expression that communicated clearly without saying anything out loud. The break came at 11:15. In the hallway, Carla said, "They're going to move." Soames stepped out to make a call, which means he's checking in with whoever is still in a decision-making position at Harlow's board. When he comes back, we get a counterproposal. How close? To what we want. Close enough that I'll be surprised if we're not done by 3. They went back in when Soames' associate knocked. Soames placed a document on the table and slid it toward Carla. "Our client's position," he said. Carla read it without reacting. She turned it so Mara could see. Mara read it once. Then again. The number was substantial, not a gesture, a real figure that would carry weight in any public accounting of what Harlow had done and what it was being held to. The public acknowledgement language was present, carefully drafted but not evasive. Harlow Medical Center, acknowledging systemic failures in billing practices, medication management, and patient outcome reporting, and acknowledging that the employment of Mara Voss had been terminated in retaliation for her reporting of those failures. She read that sentence 3 times. It was not everything. Nothing could be everything. Nothing could undo the patients, the falsified records, the 2 people who had died, the months in the motel room, the 4 stitches, the bruised rib, the nights at 2 in the morning when the future had felt genuinely uncertain in a way she had not allowed herself to admit even to Carla. Settlement documents were not built to hold the full weight of consequences, and she had always understood that, but it was specific. It was in writing. It would be on the record, and the record would persist. "What do you think?" Carla said quietly. Mara looked up from the document and opened her mouth to answer. Her phone vibrated on the table, face down, as she always kept it in important meetings, but it vibrated 3 times in rapid succession, which was the emergency pattern she had set up months ago for one specific contact and one specific purpose. She turned it over. Roland Spears. She looked at Carla. Carla looked at the phone. Something passed between them. Quick, wordless, the understanding arriving in both of them at almost the same moment. "Take it," Carla said. Mara was already standing. She pushed back her chair and walked into the hallway and answered before the 4th vibration. "Spears. Where are you right now?" His voice had a quality she had not heard from him before. Not panic, nothing close to that, but compression. A man moving on a tight timeline with no room for anything unnecessary. "Settlement conference. Harlow civil case." A half-second pause. "We need you at the federal courthouse at 2 p.m. I cannot fully explain on this line, but there are developments from the last 18 hours that directly implicate testimony you provided. Dana Frick needs you present." "What developments?" "Marsh," Spears said. "He's cooperating, and what he's giving us goes considerably further than what we charged him with." Mara stood in the hallway, one hand against the wall, the noise of the building around her reduced to a distant, unintelligible hum. Through the conference room door she could hear nothing. The room had gone quiet, everyone waiting. "How much further?" she said. "Mara." His voice was specific and careful and without the professional distance he usually maintained, and that absence of distance told her more than anything he could have said in plain language. "There are 2 other medical facilities in the region, and there are individuals inside the state health department who were receiving payments to ensure those facilities were never looked at closely." The hallway was very still. Somewhere behind her, inside the conference room, a chair moved. Papers shifted, the ordinary sounds of people waiting in a room for something to resume. She looked at the window at the end of the hall, the sky beyond it, the edge of the mountains visible at the frame's corner, solid and indifferent and exactly where they had always been while everything else moved. "How many people?" she said. "We're still establishing that. That's partly why we need you." A pause. "The documentation you compiled, the billing patterns, the outcome reporting structures, it matches the signature of what we're seeing at the other facilities. You may be the only person who can help us establish the methodology was deliberate and coordinated across all 3. She processed that. Not slowly. She processed things quickly. Always had. It was part of what she was built for. But she let herself process it fully before she spoke again. 3 facilities. A coordinated system. People inside the regulatory structure paid to look away. What she had found at Harlow had not been Harlow's invention. It had been a franchise. A method. Tested and refined and replicated, and the people who'd built it had understood that as long as the oversight mechanisms were compromised, the method was safe. Until a quiet nurse on the 3rd floor had started keeping notes. "I'll be there at 2, she said. She hung up and stood in the hallway for 3 more seconds, looking at the window, the mountains, the ordinary sky. Then she turned around and walked back into the conference room. Soames and his associates looked up. Carla looked up. Everyone in the room looked up, and something in the way Mara walked back to her chair, not rushed, not theatrical, just different from how she'd left, told them, before she said a word, that something had changed. She sat down. She looked at the settlement document still on the table in front of her, the language she had read 3 times, the acknowledgement with her name in it. Then she looked at Carla. "We need to talk," she said, "privately, right now." Carla read her face in the way she had learned to read it over the past months, quickly, accurately, without asking for more than was being given. "Excuse us," Carla said to Soames, and her voice gave nothing away, which was its own form of information. In the hallway, Carla said simply, "Tell me." Mara told her. Concisely. Spears' words, the 2 other facilities, the state health department payments, the 2 o'clock meeting at the federal courthouse. She watched Carla's face as she heard it, the professional composure doing what it always did, holding, and then something moving underneath it. "They want your methodology analysis," Carla said when Mara finished. "Yes. Which means what you documented at Harlow isn't the end of the case." Carla said it slowly, the shape of it assembling. "It's the template for a case that's 3 times as large." "That's what it sounds like." Carla looked at the conference room door, then at Mara. "The settlement in there, the document on the table, that's still real. We can still sign that today, and it would hold, and it would be a real outcome for you." "I know. But what Marsh is giving them connects to patients at 2 other hospitals who don't have anyone who kept notes," Mara said. "And if I can help Frick establish that the method was coordinated, that this was a designed system, not 3 separate failures, then the federal case becomes something that could actually prevent it from happening again somewhere else." Carla was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing to ask of yourself." "Nobody asked me," Mara said. "I'm deciding." A long pause. The building around them continued its ordinary operations. Elevator chime, distant phone, someone's shoes on the floor above. "Okay," Carla said finally. "Then here's how we do this." She turned back toward the conference room, and her hand was on the door, and Mara was right behind her. And then Carla stopped. "Mara." "Yeah." Carla turned around. She had an expression Mara had not seen on her before. Not quite professional, not quite personal, somewhere in the specific territory between them that some moments occupy. "What you've already done," Carla said. "The documentation, the board hearing, the deposition, the parking garage, the months in that motel, that would have been enough. For most people, it would have been more than enough." Mara looked at her. "I know. I just wanted to say that before you walked back in there and made it bigger." A beat. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered. "Thank you," Mara said. They went back in. And 20 minutes later, when Mara and Carla walked out of that conference room with a signed document and a 2 o'clock appointment at the federal courthouse, and a case that had just expanded to encompass 3 institutions and a corrupted regulatory system and more patients than Mara wanted to count before she had to. Nobody in that conference room said anything as they left. But Soames watched her walk out, and his expression, in the moment before he controlled it, was the expression of a man who had spent this entire proceeding expecting to be dealing with a problem and had understood too late that he had been dealing with something else entirely. The elevator doors closed behind her. The building lobby opened onto the street, and at the federal courthouse across the city, in a room Mara had not yet entered, Colton Marsh was sitting across from Dana Frick with a folder in front of him, and the names in that folder were the names of people who had believed for years that they were untouchable. They had believed that right up until this morning. The federal courthouse on Meridian Street was a different kind of building than Harlow Medical Center, but it had one thing in common with it: the gap between what it projected from the outside and what actually happened inside. The exterior was all civic solemnity, granite and symmetry, the architectural language of permanence and authority. Inside, it ran on fluorescent light and institutional carpet and the low, sustained hum of a machinery that moved at its own pace regardless of what anyone outside it wanted. Mara walked in at 1:53. Dana Frick met her in the hallway outside the 3rd-floor conference room, and the first thing Mara noticed was that Frick had not gone home the previous night. She could tell from the specific quality of the alertness, the kind that was being maintained rather than occurring naturally, eyes a fraction too precise, movements a fraction too considered. Mara had seen that look in the field, on people who had been awake for 30 hours and were running on the clarity that sometimes arrived on the other side of exhaustion before the collapse. "Thank you for coming," Frick said. "Tell me what you have," Mara said. They went into the conference room. Spears was there, along with 2 people Mara hadn't met. A woman introduced as a senior investigator from the FBI's healthcare fraud unit named Tamsin Rowe, and a man from the Colorado Attorney General's office named Porter Hatch, who had the contained energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for a door to open and was now moving through it as fast as professional protocol allowed. On the table was a physical map, actual paper, which struck Mara as deliberate, the kind of choice made when you didn't want things on a screen that could be photographed, showing the Colorado Front Range with 3 locations marked. Harlow Medical Center in Callaway, a facility called Ridgecrest General in a city called Dunmore, 40 miles south. A third facility, marked with a different color, called Vantage Medical Partners in the eastern suburbs of the state capital. Not a hospital, exactly. A large outpatient surgical and diagnostic center that Mara had heard of peripherally and never thought much about. Marsh gave us Ridgecrest and Vantage this morning, Frick said. He's been building toward cooperation since the airport. His attorney reached out within 6 hours of his arrest. What he gave us about Harlow, we already largely had. What he gave us about the other 2, we did not. The methodology, Mara said. The methodology, Frick confirmed. All 3 facilities were operating under the same billing and documentation framework, same inflation structure on procedures, same approach to outcome reporting, same medication diversion channel, which ran through a single distribution intermediary that serviced all 3. She paused. This was not 3 separate schemes. This was one scheme implemented across 3 locations, with centralized financial management and a shared protocol for handling internal problems. Handling internal problems, Mara said, meaning employees who noticed, meaning that yes. Tamsin Rowe spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and direct. Marsh says there were 4 prior instances of employees raising internal concerns across the 3 facilities over the past 6 years. 2 were managed through termination and non-disclosure agreements. 1 through license board complaints that were manufactured the same way yours was. 1, she paused, and her pause was specific, the pause of someone choosing how to deliver a weight. 1 through a process we're still investigating that resulted in the employee's departure from the state. The room was quiet for a moment. Departure from the state, Mara said. They relocated. We don't know the full circumstances yet. We're working on it. Mara sat with that. 4 people before her. 4 people who had seen the same machinery and been fed into it and had come out the other side without the things she had, the military background that had created the DoD connection, the particular stubbornness that Carla had called useful and her mother had called a character flaw, the decision on a Tuesday night in March to call a veterans hotline instead of pouring a glass of wine and going to sleep. There was nothing she could do with that knowledge right now except hold it, so she held it and moved on. What do you need from me? She said. Frick had a folder on the table. She opened it to a series of pages that Mara recognized, with a slight jolt, as her own documentation. The billing analysis she had compiled, the discrepancy charts, the notes she had kept in the careful, structured format she'd developed over the months at Harlow. Your documentation of the billing patterns at Harlow is the most complete external record we have of how the scheme operated at the ground level, Frick said. What we need from you is to walk through the Ridgecrest and Vantage billing structures that Marsh disclosed and tell us, from your clinical experience, whether the methodology matches what you saw at Harlow. You're asking me to be an expert witness. Informally today. Formally, yes. We'll need that testimony when this goes to trial. Mara looked at the documents, then at the map with its 3 colored pins, then at Frick. Put them in front of me, she said. What followed was 3.5 hours of the most concentrated analytical work Mara had done since the months she had spent building her original documentation. And it was work of a different kind, not gathering, but interpreting, bringing 11 years of clinical experience to bear on records she was seeing for the first time and being asked to read at speed. She read them at speed. The Ridgecrest billing structures were less sophisticated than Harlow's. Cruder inflation, less consistent coding manipulation, the kind of scheme that suggested it had been running longer and had gotten lazy because nothing had ever challenged it. The Vantage records were the opposite. More refined, tighter documentation, the medication diversion channel almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it specifically. She pointed out 3 things in the Vantage records within the first 20 minutes that Rowe flagged and photographed and took out of the room briefly, returning with the expression of someone who had just confirmed something they had suspected but couldn't previously support. You saw that immediately, Rowe said. It's the same logic as what they did at Harlow, just cleaner, Mara said. When you administer a medication, there's a clinical note, a pharmacy dispense record, and a billing code. Those three things should tell the same story. Advantage, the billing code and the clinical note match, but the dispense records show a pattern of batch processing that doesn't align with individual patient administration times. Someone was dispensing in bulk and billing individually. The difference went somewhere. How long did it take you to identify that pattern at Harlow? Frick asked. About 4 months of paying attention, Mara said. But I wasn't looking for it initially. If I'd known what to look for from the start, probably 2 weeks. Frick made a note. Hatch, from the Attorney General's office, had been quiet through most of the session but was writing steadily. He looked up now. Ms. Voss, the State Health Department connection, Marsh indicated that 2 individuals within the department's hospital oversight division were receiving payments. He gave us names. We're not disclosing those names publicly yet, but I want you to know they represent the reason that none of this was caught in routine inspection. Mara had expected something like this since Spears had told her on the phone, but hearing it specified was different from expecting it. For how long? She said. Marsh says the arrangement began approximately 4 years ago. Before that, the scheme was smaller and better hidden. Once the oversight was managed, they expanded. She thought about that. 4 years of inspections that had found nothing because they were not meant to find anything. 4 years of accreditation renewals and compliance reports and whatever public-facing accountability the system was supposed to provide. All of it moving smoothly on its rails because the rails had been bought. The 2 individuals in the department, she said. Where are they now? Hatch looked at her steadily. As of this morning, one is on administrative leave pending investigation. The other came in voluntarily at 7 a.m. with their attorney. They knew Marsh was cooperating. They knew something had shifted. Yes, Ichet. She left the federal courthouse at 5:41 in the afternoon, into a city that had turned cold and blue with the early winter dark. Carla was waiting outside. She had been in the building's lobby for the last hour, having wrapped up the settlement paperwork and filed it, and she met Mara on the steps with 2 cups of coffee from the cart across the street. Mara took the coffee, and they walked for a few minutes before either of them spoke. How bad is it? Carla said finally. For them? Significantly worse than this morning. Mara wrapped both hands around the cup. Marsh is talking, 2 state regulators are folding, and the Vantage and Ridgecrest records are going to connect to Harlow in a way that makes the original charges look like the outline of something much larger. Carla was quiet for a moment. How are you doing? It was the second time she had asked that question today, and both times Mara had given a version of the same non-answer. This time she stopped walking and thought about it honestly. There were 4 people before me, she said, across the 3 facilities. 4 people who noticed what I noticed and got handled. One of them is in a different state, and the circumstances are still unclear. She paused. I keep thinking about what the difference was between me and them. You had a DOD connection through your veterans filing, Carla said. I had that. And other things. Specific advantages that had nothing to do with being more right than they were or more courageous. She looked at the coffee cup. They were probably just as right, probably just as willing to keep going. They just didn't have what I had. Carla let that sit without trying to reframe it, which was one of the things Mara had come to value about her. What happens to them now? Mara said. If the federal case names the systematic suppression of internal reporting, which it sounds like it will, then what happened to those 4 people becomes part of the public record. Their NDA provisions may be unenforceable if they were signed under duress or as part of a fraudulent scheme. The one who relocated. That depends on what the investigation finds. Carla paused. It won't undo what was done to them, but it won't stay buried either. Mara nodded. She started walking again. The settlement we signed today, she said. It still holds? It holds. The federal developments actually strengthen our position post-signing. If Harlow tries to contest it, the expanded federal case makes any court fight much worse for them than honoring the agreement. Carla looked at her. You're financially protected. Your license restoration is in the documentation. The public acknowledgement is in the documentation. Whatever happens next in the federal proceedings doesn't change what you secured today. Good, Mara said. That's good. She meant it. She was tired enough that the relief of it could reach her now in a way it hadn't been able to earlier in the day, when everything was still moving too fast to feel. The news moved on a different clock than the federal machinery, and over the following 2 weeks it moved fast. The story of Marcia's cooperation broke 4 days after the courthouse meeting, not from any source Mara could identify, but from the particular kind of leak that happened when enough people in enough offices knew enough of what was happening that containment became geometrically impossible. The initial reporting was incomplete but directionally accurate. Harlow Medical Center's COO, cooperating with federal prosecutors, the investigation expanding to include 2 additional regional healthcare facilities, state regulators under investigation for accepting payments. The story ran nationally by day 2. A major network picked it up on day 3 with a segment that included the phrase "systemic regional healthcare fraud" in its headline, which Carla sent to Mara with a single-word text. There it is. Ridgecrest General's board issued a statement the morning after the network segment, expressing commitment to transparency and announcing the immediate resignation of their CEO and 2 board members. The statement was the kind of thing institutions issued when they understood the wave was coming and wanted to be seen getting ahead of it. Mara read it once and put her phone down. The language of institutional remorse she had found was one of the more reliable indicators of institutional fear. Vantage Medical Partners was quieter and moved more strategically. They announced a third-party compliance review before any charges were officially filed against them, which their attorneys had apparently advised them was their best positioning. Whether it would help them, Carla said, depended on what the third-party review found and how that compared to what federal prosecutors already had. If the records match what Marsh said, Carla told her, the compliance review is theater. It might buy them some public relations benefit, but it doesn't change the legal exposure. And if the records don't match, Mara said, then someone has been very busy in the Vantage records room in the past week, and that busyness will itself become evidence. The 2 state health department officials were formally placed on leave and named in supplementary filings that became public 12 days after the courthouse session. Their names ran in the news alongside a summary of the payments Marsh had described, and the summary was specific enough, dollar amounts, dates, methods, that it was clearly based on documented evidence rather than allegation. One of them made a statement through their attorney claiming no wrongdoing. The other said nothing publicly, which Hatch had told Mara, in a brief follow-up call, was consistent with the posture of someone who had already retained counsel and was in active discussions with prosecutors. Mara followed all of it from a distance that felt healthier than the proximity of the preceding months. She was back in her apartment. She was sleeping. She had started returning non-urgent phone calls, which was a reliable indicator for her of functional stability. She went running every morning and sometimes noticed the mountains without thinking about anything specifically, just the fact of them, which was its own kind of restoration. She also gave the formal expert witness statement that Frick had requested, 2 sessions at the U.S. Attorney's Office, structured around the billing analysis, walking through the Harlow methodology and its correspondence with the patterns at Ridgecrest and Vantage. She delivered it the same way she had delivered everything throughout this entire period, thoroughly, chronologically, without embellishment. Frick thanked her after the second session and told her the testimony was exactly what they needed. The trial is probably 8 to 14 months out, Frick said. We'll need you available. I'll be available, Mara said. Are you going back to nursing? As soon as the license restoration clears, which should be within the month. Frick looked at her for a moment, and the look was not quite professional, but was not intrusive either. Good, she said. That's the right thing. Mara was in a grocery store on a Thursday afternoon when her phone rang with a number she recognized as Hatch's direct line. She stepped to the end of an empty aisle and answered. We arrested Greg Tully this morning, Hatch said. She had been holding a can of soup. She set it back on the shelf. What charge? Obstruction and conspiracy. The expanded investigation produced evidence that Tully was not only aware of the scheme but was actively involved in managing the suppression of internal reporting, including yours. Specifically, his communications with Dorcas Webb before she went to him with information about your documentation. Dorcas Webb. The name landed with a particular quality. Not surprised, she had stopped being surprised by any of this several weeks ago, but something else. The tired weight of confirmation. Dorcas in the break room complaining so specifically about administration and then walking directly to Tully's office. That piece of it had never been ambiguous to Mara. But there was a difference between knowing something and having it formally confirmed in a federal obstruction charge. The communications between them, Mara said. They documented it? Tully used his Harlow email for part of it, which was not a sophisticated choice. Webb's personal cell records, which we subpoenaed as part of the broader investigation, fill in the rest. Mara thought about the timeline. The day she had shown Dorcas a portion of her documentation, and the 2 days between that and the HR meeting with Sandra Keel. 2 days had felt fast to her at the time. It made more sense now. Not organic reporting of a concern, but a managed response to a specific threat, coordinated between Dorcas and Tully, with a deliberateness that put it squarely in the category of something that had a name in federal law. Webb? Mara said. She's a potential cooperating witness. No charges against her yet, but the investigation into her role is active. After she hung up, Mara stood at the end of the grocery aisle for a moment. The store went about its afternoon around her, a cart rolling past, a child asking a question at the far end of the aisle, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday in a functioning city. She picked the soup back up and put it in her basket. The nursing license restoration arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the settlement was signed, in the form of a letter from the state nursing board that was 2 paragraphs long and matter-of-fact in its language and represented the most important piece of mail she had received in her adult life. She read it standing at her kitchen counter. Then she sat down. The letter confirmed the full reinstatement of her nursing license, with no conditions, no restrictions, and a formal notation in her record that the prior administrative review had been initiated under circumstances that the board had determined were not consistent with legitimate patient safety reporting procedures, language that had been negotiated carefully, and that meant, in plain terms, that the threat to her license was officially on record as having been manufactured. She called her mother. Her mother cried, quietly and briefly, and then composed herself and said, I knew it the whole time. I know you did, Mara said. Are you going back to work? I already have a call into a trauma unit. She had, in fact, already received a response. A call from the director of the trauma department at Callaway Regional, a hospital on the south side of the city that had nothing to do with Harlow, who had heard what had happened to Mara and had reached out through Carla with an offer that was professional and straightforward, and which Mara was intending to accept. Probably within 2 weeks. Her mother made a sound that Mara didn't have a word for, the specific auditory texture of a parent's relief. Come visit before you start. I will, Mara said. I promise. She meant it. She was going to get in a car and drive to Tucson and eat her mother's cooking and sleep in the childhood bedroom with the window that didn't fully close and spend 3 days being a daughter instead of a plaintiff or a witness or a problem that an institution had decided to eliminate. She had been earning that trip for 5 months, and she was going to take it. But first there was something she needed to do. She had thought about it for a while, not obsessively, but consistently, the way important things persisted in the back of her mind without demanding immediate attention. She had thought about it the morning the nursing license letter arrived, and the afternoon Hatch had called about Tully, and the evening she had found Wendell Groff's text waiting on her phone. She needed to go to the courthouse. Not for a hearing, not for a deposition, not to support any specific legal proceeding. She needed to go to the building where the federal case against Harlow and its network would eventually be tried, and she needed to sit in the gallery during the preliminary hearing that was scheduled for that week, the first public proceeding at which the defendants would be formally arraigned on the expanded charges, because she needed to see it with her own eyes. Carla came with her. They sat in the back of the gallery on a Wednesday morning and watched Colton Marsh be led into the courtroom in a suit that fit him the same way it always had, and with an expression that did not fit him the same way at all. The man who had run a 3-facility criminal health care operation for years, who had ordered the attack in the parking garage, who had been 40 minutes from boarding a connecting flight out of the country when federal agents had found him at the gate, that man sat down at the defendant's table and looked, for the first time in all of this, like someone who understood the specific dimensions of what was happening to him. Victor Hale was beside him, the billing department executives, the board member, and in a separate arraignment that Mara had not known would be scheduled the same morning, Greg Tully. Tully came in last. He did not look at the gallery. He sat down and looked at the table, and the set of his shoulders was not the shoulders of the man who had sat behind his desk and used the word friction and smiled the smile that didn't move above his cheekbones. The arraignment was procedural, Charges read, pleas entered, bail conditions addressed. It took 45 minutes. The formal trial, Judge Patton had indicated in her most recent scheduling order, would begin in 9 months. Mara sat in the gallery and watched it, and felt Carla beside her and listened to the machinery of the courtroom doing the slow, essential, imperfect work of accountability. After, on the courthouse steps, she kept ending up on courthouse steps, she thought. It was becoming a signature location for significant moments. Carla said, "How does it feel?" Mara considered the question seriously. "Like it's real," she said. "It's been real for a while, but watching that specifically, it stopped being abstract." "Good," Carla said. "It should feel real." They walked down the steps together. The morning was cold and clear, the mountains sharp against the sky in the way they got when the air was dry and the light was direct. Mara pulled her coat closer and looked at the street and thought about Tucson and her mother's cooking and the trauma unit at Callaway Regional and what it would feel like to walk into a hospital again without the weight of the preceding months pressing down on everything. She was thinking about that when her phone rang. Spears. She looked at the phone, then at Carla, then answered. "I need to ask you something," Spears said, and his voice had a quality she recognized from the morning he had told her about Marcia's cooperation. Compressed. Specific. Moving on a timeline. "Go ahead." "The methodology documentation you provided, the billing analysis, the medication diversion structure. We've been running it through a comparative analysis with fraud patterns reported in other states." A pause. "There are 6 additional facilities outside Colorado that show correspondence. Significant correspondence." Mara stopped walking. Carla stopped beside her. 6, she said, in 4 states. The intermediary distributor that ran the medication diversion channel. They're based in Nevada, and they service facilities across the Mountain West and into the Midwest. What started in Colorado was never just Colorado. The street was ordinary around her. Feet on pavement, traffic, a bus moving through the intersection ahead. The mountains in the distance, unchanged. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to work with a multi-state federal task force as a clinical consultant, not as a witness, as an active contributor to identifying affected facilities and patient populations before the task force moves to the warrant stage." Another pause. "Your name would not be public. The work would be structured around your availability. But what you understand about how this scheme operates at the clinical level, we don't have anyone else who knows it from the inside." 6 facilities, 4 states, a distribution network that had been servicing a multi-state fraud operation for years. And somewhere inside each of those 6 facilities, patients with billing statements that didn't match their care, medications that had been diverted, outcomes that had been falsified for reports that nobody had adequately scrutinized because the scrutiny had been bought, and probably, in at least some of them, employees who had noticed. Quiet people who had kept notes and trusted someone they shouldn't have, or calculated wrong, or simply not had what Mara had happened to have, and who were now somewhere on the other side of the machinery that had ground them through. "How soon?" she said. "We'd want to begin within 30 days. She looked at Carla, who had heard enough of the call from proximity to understand the broad shape of it, and whose expression was the expression of someone waiting for a decision she already knew the answer to. Mara had told Frick she wanted to go back to nursing. She had meant that, and she was going to do it. The trauma unit at Callaway Regional was not going away, and the work was not going away, and the patients who needed it were not going away. That was permanent, and she could return to it. This was something that would not wait and would not exist in the same form if she stepped away from it, and involved people in 4 states who did not yet know that anyone was looking. She thought about Donald Fitch and his envelope. She thought about the supply room with its empty shelves and the log that lied. She thought about the quiet nurse on the 3rd floor who had decided to pay closer attention, and where paying closer attention had brought her, and what it had built, and what it could still build if she was willing. She thought about what Carla had said on the steps outside the settlement conference before they went back in. That would have been enough. For most people, it would have been more than enough. She thought about the kind of person she had always known herself to be. 30 days, she said. "I'll need my first 2 weeks for personal time. I made a commitment I'm keeping. After that, I'm available." A brief pause on the line, then, "Understood. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I haven't started." She hung up. The mountain air was cold on her face. Carla was looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between professional admiration and the slightly exhausted fondness of someone who had spent the last 5 months watching a person refuse, with complete consistency, to take the easier path. 6 more facilities, Carla said. 4 states. And you said yes. I said after Tucson, Mara said. Carla looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed. Not the short, surprised laugh from before, but a real one, full enough that it seemed to catch her off guard. Go to Tucson, she said. I'm going, Mara said. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the courthouse behind them, at the street ahead of them, at the mountains beyond the buildings, at the edge of the city. She thought about driving south through the high desert, the altitude falling away, the air warming by degrees, her mother's voice on the phone last night saying, I knew it the whole time, with the particular conviction of someone who had needed to believe that and had turned out to be right. She started walking. And behind her, inside the courthouse, in the room where Colton Marsh and Victor Hale and Greg Tully had sat that morning with their attorneys and their charges and the specific gravity of what they were facing. The clerk was closing the record of the arraignment, logging the case number, filing the documentation that would be retrieved and built upon over the next 9 months, until the day they stood before a judge and jury and answered for what they had built and what it had cost. That process was going to take the time it was going to take. Mara had learned to work with what was possible rather than waiting for what was perfect. She walked to Carla's car. She had a drive to plan and a bag to pack and a promise to keep. The rest of it, the task force, the 4 states, the 6 facilities, the patients who didn't yet know anyone was coming, all of that would be there when she got back. Except that evening, sitting in her apartment checking her email before she started packing, she found one she had not expected. It was from an address she didn't recognize, a personal email account with a name she didn't know. The subject line was blank. The message was 3 sentences. You don't know me. I worked at Ridgecrest General for 4 years. I have documentation you need to see. Mara read it 3 times. She looked at the timestamp, sent 6 hours ago, in the middle of the afternoon, while she and Carla had been sitting in the gallery watching the arraignment. She looked at the name in the sender field. Not one she knew, not one that had appeared in anything she had read or heard over the past months. She thought about 4 people before her, across 3 facilities, handled one by one in the dark. She thought about 6 more facilities, 4 states, a distribution network, and all the things that had been operating on the assumption that nobody who understood them from the inside was ever going to find each other. She opened a reply window, and she started typing. She typed 4 sentences. I'm Mara Voss. I've seen documentation from Harlow Medical Center, and I've been working with federal investigators on the regional case. If what you have is what I think it is, you're not alone and you haven't been for a while. Can we talk by phone? She read it back once. Then she sent it and closed the laptop and sat in her apartment in the quiet, and understood that the thing she had thought was arriving at its conclusion had just opened a door she hadn't known was there. She did not open the laptop again that night. She packed her bag for Tucson instead, methodically, practically, the way she packed everything without excess. She set her alarm for 5:30. She turned off the lights. She lay in the dark and listened to the city outside and thought about a person she had never met who had worked at a facility 40 miles south of her for 4 years and had, at some point during those 4 years, started paying closer attention and had, at some further point, decided to do something with what they had noticed. She thought, I know exactly how that feels. She fell asleep before 11, which was the earliest she had fallen asleep in longer than she could easily calculate. Tucson was warm in a way that Colorado in November was not, and her mother's house smelled like cumin and coffee and the specific combination of things that houses absorb over decades and can never be replicated anywhere else. And Mara sat at her mother's kitchen table on the first evening and ate a real meal and did not think about billing codes or federal timelines or the email from the unknown sender at Ridgecrest General. She thought about those things by the second evening. But by then the distance had done some of its work, and she could think about them without the same quality of sustained pressure that had characterized the preceding months. She had called the number the sender provided. A woman named Becca Strand, 41 years old, who had worked as a clinical data coordinator at Ridgecrest General for 4 years and 3 months before being terminated 9 months ago for what Ridgecrest's HR department had described as performance deficiencies that she had contested and lost. The call lasted 40 minutes. Mara listened more than she spoke, and what she heard was a version of a familiar story told in a different voice. The same machinery, the same escalation, the same methodical dismantling of a person who had noticed something and refused to unknow it. But Becca Strand had something Mara had not had in the early months. She had documentation that was different in kind from Mara's, not billing analyses or pharmacy records, but internal communications. Emails from Ridgecrest administrators discussing the coordination protocol, discussing the distribution intermediary, discussing, in terms that were thinly coded but not given context, ambiguous, the management of employees who had become visibility risks. Visibility risks, Mara repeated. That's the phrase they used, Becca Strand said. Her voice was steady but with an underlying quality that Mara recognized. The steadiness of someone who had been holding something alone for a long time and was uncertain whether putting it down would hurt more than continuing to carry it. I didn't know what to do with them. After everything that happened, I was afraid. I signed an NDA when they terminated me. I didn't know if I could even talk to anyone. ND, as signed in the context of fraudulent conduct, are unenforceable, Mara said. You need an attorney, and I can give you a name, but the short version is that they cannot legally prevent you from cooperating with a federal investigation. A long silence on the line, then, a federal investigation? Yes, Mara said, there is one. It now covers Ridgecrest, and what you have is the kind of thing that federal prosecutors need to see. Another silence, longer this time. Mara waited it out because she understood that this particular silence was not empty. It was the sound of someone recalibrating the landscape of a situation they had been trapped inside for 9 months, finding that the walls were not where they had appeared to be. Okay, Becca Strand said finally. Tell me what to do. She forwarded Becca Strand's contact information to Frick before she left Tucson with a brief summary of the call and a note about the internal communications. Frick responded within an hour. A short email, professional, but with something in its brevity that communicated urgency. Thank you. We'll reach out to her today. Mara spent 3 days in Tucson. She ate well. She slept. She walked in the dry heat of the desert morning while her mother slept in, and she sat in the yard in the afternoon and looked at the different quality of light, softer than Colorado's, less angular, and let herself rest in the way that only became fully possible when she was somewhere with no immediate demands on her attention. On the last evening, her mother sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me what's next." Mara looked at her. Her mother was 63, with Mara's same directness in the eyes, and a life that had contained more difficulty than she usually discussed. And she was asking the question the way she asked most things. Not for reassurance, but for information. The federal trial starts in about 8 months, Mara said. I'll testify. I'm also going to be consulting on the expanded investigation for a while, other facilities, other states, and I'm going back to nursing. I have a position at Callaway Regional. Her mother nodded slowly. All of that at the same time. Not all at once, in stages. You're tired, her mother said. Yes. You're not going to stop. No, Mara said. But I'm going to do it differently than I've been doing it. Less alone. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Mara's, not lingering, not sentimental, just present. Good, she said. That's the part I was waiting to hear. She drove back to Callaway on a Sunday morning and arrived in the late afternoon to an apartment that was hers. In a way, it had not felt like hers for months. Since before the administrative leave, before the motel room, before the parking garage and the stitches and the bruised rib, and all the weeks of sleeping in a strange bed under a name that wasn't quite hers. She unpacked properly for the first time in 2 months. She ran a full grocery trip. She opened the windows and let the cold Colorado air move through the rooms. She called Carla and said she was back, and Carla said good and told her that Harlow's board had formally dissolved itself 2 days prior, and that the hospital was currently operating under state-appointed administrative oversight pending the outcome of the federal proceedings. They dissolved the board, Mara said. What was left of it had nothing to work with. The incoming oversight will run the facility until the criminal proceedings resolve, at which point the state will determine whether Harlow can continue operating and under what conditions. Mara thought about that. The building on the north edge of downtown with its glass and steel and its fountain in the lobby, continuing to function as a hospital, patients continuing to come through its doors because hospitals did not stop being needed simply because the people running them had been arrested. The building itself was not the problem. The work inside it was not the problem. The patients were not the problem. They never had been. What about the patients, she said. The ones with the fraudulent billing? The settlement fund includes a patient compensation component. It was in the federal consent agreement that Harlow's remaining legal entity signed last week. Families who can document specific harm have a claims process. The U.S. Attorney's Office announced it publicly on Thursday. A pause. Donald Fitch has already been contacted. Mara stood in her kitchen with the phone and looked out the window at the city in the early evening light, and felt something arrive that she hadn't been able to name when Carla had asked her how she was doing on the courthouse steps. Not relief exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a thing that has been held for a very long time beginning, incrementally, to be set down. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "I knew you'd want to know." But she started at Callaway Regional on a Monday morning in December, 3 weeks after returning from Tucson. The shift started at 7. She arrived at 6:40, which was how she always arrived, early enough to have the room under her before anything was required of her. The trauma unit was on the second floor, smaller than Harlow's but more efficiently organized, with a staffing model that the charge nurse, a tall, unhurried man named Desmond Webb, no relation to Dorcas, she had confirmed that before accepting the position, described on her first morning as actually honest about what we can handle. "That's a rare thing," Mara said. "We've made it a priority," he said, without making a speech about it, which she appreciated. The first shift was hard, in the ordinary ways that first shifts at new facilities were hard. Learning where things were, learning the rhythms of the space, the specific vocabulary of this particular team. She made 3 requests of people and got direct answers each time, which told her something useful about the culture. She asked one question about a medication storage protocol, and the pharmacist on duty explained the reasoning without being asked to, which told her something else. She was not a senior nurse here yet. She was the new person, and the new person's job was to watch and learn and earn trust through demonstrated competence rather than personal history. That was fine. She had done it before and she would do it again, and she had always preferred earning things to being granted them. Her first patient that morning was a 44-year-old woman named Rosario Delgado, who had come in after a car accident, moderate injuries, disoriented from the impact, frightened in the way people were when they found themselves suddenly in a hospital and couldn't fully account for how they'd gotten there. Mara settled her with the specific quality of attention that she had always given the people in her care: present, practical, not falsely cheerful. She explained what was happening in language that was clear without being condescending. She answered the question Rosario asked twice without showing impatience the second time, because she understood that people in shock asked the same questions twice, and the answer needed to be consistent and calm both times. When Rosario's daughter arrived in the afternoon, visibly shaken, still in her work clothes, Mara updated her on her mother's status with the same directness she'd given Rosario, and watched the daughter's face move from fear to something more manageable. That transition, the moment when a person's face changed from the look of someone who did not know whether they could handle what was happening to the look of someone who understood what was happening and had a frame for it, was the thing Mara had always cared about most in this work. The information itself was only part of it. The frame mattered. The steadiness of the person delivering it mattered. She drove home that evening tired in the way she hadn't been tired in months. Muscle tired, the good kind. The kind that came from work rather than from sustained vigilance. She ate dinner and called her mother and said the first shift had been fine, and her mother said just fine. And Mara said it had been good, actually, and that was true. The multi-state task force work began in January. Frick had connected her to the team lead, a federal investigator named Grace Odom, based in Denver, who coordinated between 4 U.S. attorneys' offices and ran the task force with the no-nonsense organization of someone who had done complex multi-jurisdictional work before and had no patience for unnecessary complexity. Their first meeting was a video call, 90 minutes, at the end of which Odom said, "You're exactly what Frick told me you were." "What did Frick tell you I was?" Mara said. "Clinical, precise. not interested in being told things are more complicated than they are. A pause. That's a compliment. I took it as one. The work was structured around her nursing schedule. She consulted 2 days a week, remotely, reviewing facility documentation and providing clinical interpretation to investigators who could identify financial irregularities, but needed someone who understood the medical logic to explain how the irregularities translated into patient-level harm. It was the same skills she had used at Harlow, the same training she had brought to the parking garage and the nursing board hearing in the U.S. Attorney's office now applied systematically and formally to a problem she now understood in its full dimensions. 6 facilities, 4 states, 12,000 estimated affected patients over 7 years, a number that the task force's forensic accountants were still refining and that Mara had seen in an internal document and then needed to sit with for a while before she could engage with it analytically rather than personally. 12,000 people. 12,000 billing statements for procedures that hadn't been performed, medications that had been diverted, records of recoveries that were cleaner than the actual recoveries had been. She held that number and did the only thing she could do with it, which was the same thing she had always done. Showed up, paid attention, and documented with precision what she understood so that people with the authority and the tools to act on it could do exactly that. Becca Strand's documentation proved as significant as Mara had assessed it would be. The internal communications she had preserved showed the coordination protocol in explicit enough terms that Frick described them, in a case update that Mara was included on, as the connective tissue we needed. Becca had been connected with an attorney Carla recommended, had been formally recognized as a cooperating federal witness, and had had her NDA voided by a federal judge in a 2-page order that didn't waste any words. She and Mara had spoken 3 more times by phone and had arrived at the particular kind of connection that forms between people who have walked through the same fire without knowing each other. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but something with the potential to become it. There was also in February the matter of the 4th person, the employee who had relocated from one of the Ridgecrest facilities years earlier, under circumstances that had been described to Mara as unclear. The investigation had found them. They were living in New Mexico and had been for 3 years, and they had signed an NDA under conditions that the federal investigators were treating as coercive, and they were now, under the same legal framework that had freed Becca Strand from her NDA, able to speak. Their name was Marcus Ewan. He was a clinical pharmacist. He had noticed medication diversion at Ridgecrest 4 years before Mara had ever walked into Harlow, and he had reported it internally. And what had happened to him afterward was more thorough and more personal than what had happened to Mara. He had been terminated, blacklisted through a network of administrative contacts Marsh had maintained across the industry, and had ultimately had to leave the state to find work in a market where his name hadn't been managed against him. Mara spoke to him once, in a call arranged through Odom. He was quiet and careful, and spoke about what had happened to him with the particular economy of someone who had rehearsed nothing, was not performing anything, was simply describing events he had already processed enough times that the describing of them no longer required much preparation. At the end of the call, he said, "Do you think any of this would have happened if you hadn't made that veterans hotline call?" Mara thought about that honestly. "I don't know," she said. "The federal investigation was already 14 months in when I made contact. They might have gotten there without me." "But you accelerated it." "Maybe. The documentation I had connected pieces they were missing. Whether they would have found those pieces another way? I can't say." A pause. "I'm asking because I need to understand whether it was just timing," Marcus said. "Whether I could have done what you did, if I'd had different timing." "You reported through the proper channels," Mara said. "That's what you were supposed to do. The channels were compromised. That's not a failure of your judgment." "Then what was the difference?" She thought about it. The veterans hotline, the DoD connection, the specific network of things that had given her access to a mechanism that had been outside the compromised system. "Access," she said. "I had access to a reporting mechanism they hadn't bought. That's not something you could have known to use because there was no reason to know it existed for this purpose." Another pause. Longer. "I've been telling myself I should have done more for 4 years," he said. "You documented what you found," Mara said. "You reported it. They came after you and you kept your documentation rather than surrendering it, which is why it still exists to be used now." That is doing more. It just didn't look like what you expected it to look like. She didn't know if that helped him. She hoped it did. She understood that it might take a long time to help him, and that some of what had been done to him might not be fully reparable, and that the federal case and the resulting accountability, significant as they were, could not give back 4 years of professional exile or the specific toll of living inside a situation that had made you feel like a person who had failed. She knew something about that particular toll. She had paid a version of it herself. The trial began in September. It ran for 11 weeks. Mara testified on week 3. 2 days on the stand, the first for direct examination by the prosecution, the second for cross-examination by defense counsel representing Marsh and Hale, who were being tried jointly. The cross-examination was aggressive in the careful, professional way of attorneys who had no good counterarguments and therefore needed to attack the credibility of the source. They questioned her methodology, her motivations, her military background, the gap in her employment record from her classified deployment, the fact that she had consulted for the federal task force, which they characterized as a conflict of interest. She answered every question directly, without defensiveness, without over-explaining, without giving them anything extra to work with. She had been prepared for every line of questioning by the prosecution team, but the preparation was almost unnecessary. She simply knew what she knew, and knowing it clearly was its own form of armor. At one point, defense counsel for Marsh asked her, "Isn't it true that your original motivation for collecting this documentation was professional grievance, that you were, by your own admission, a nurse who had been repeatedly reprimanded for creating friction with the medical staff?" Mara looked at him. "My original motivation was a 63-year-old patient named Donald Fitch, who received a billing statement for $22,000 in procedures he didn't receive. My motivation throughout was patient harm. Whether I was disciplined for identifying it doesn't change what I identified." A pause in the courtroom. Defense counsel moved on. She stepped down from the stand on the afternoon of the second day and walked past the defense table without looking at it and found Carla in the gallery, and they left the courthouse together and stood on the steps in the September air, and Carla said, "You were exceptional." "I was accurate," Mara said. "That's the same thing in a courtroom." The verdict came on a Friday in November, 14 months after the first arrests. Mara was at work when the call came, in the trauma unit at Callaway Regional, mid-shift, and she stepped into the hallway to take it because Desmond had made it clear from her first week that she was allowed to take important calls when they came. It was Carla. "Guilty," Carla said. "All counts. Marsh, Hale, the billing executives, the board member, all of them." Mara stood in the hallway. The unit went about its afternoon around her. Call bells, footsteps, the low rhythm of the floor functioning. "Tully?" she said. "Separate verdict, same day. Guilty on the obstruction and conspiracy charges. His sentencing is in 6 weeks. The state health department officials? Both pled before trial. Sentences were handed down last month. You saw the filings." "I know. I wanted to hear you say all of it together." Carla was quiet for a moment. Then, "Marsh is facing 12 to 18 years under the sentencing guidelines. Hale, 8 to 12. The others ranging from 3 to 7. The sentencing hearing for the primary defendants is in January." Mara leaned against the wall of the hallway and looked at the ceiling. The ordinary institutional ceiling of a functioning hospital, the kind of ceiling she had looked at from below for most of her working life, and which she had never particularly noticed until this moment, when it seemed specifically present. "The patients," she said. "The compensation process. 347 claims filed as of last week. 42 approved and paid out already. The remainder in process. The Ridgecrest and Vantage funds are running parallel through the federal case." A pause. "Donald Fitch's claim was one of the first approved." Mara closed her eyes briefly. Not for sentiment, just to let that land fully before she moved on from it. "Marcus Ewan," she said. "His legal team filed a separate civil case against Ridgecrest and the distribution intermediary for the professional harm he sustained. Last I heard, they were in settlement discussions. His attorney thinks it resolves before spring." "Good," Mara said. "That's good." Becca Strand's wrongful termination case settled last month. I don't know the terms, that was her attorney's deal, but she sent me a note saying she's going back to work at a facility in Denver. Mara stood in the hallway and absorbed all of it. Not in the way you absorbed good news that was simple, but in the more complicated way you absorbed the resolution of things that had cost something real to reach. The verdicts were real. The compensation claims were real. The professional restoration of people who had been systematically destroyed by an institution that had operated for years on the calculation that the cost of being caught would never come due. All of it was real. And none of it undid the years. None of it restored Marcus Ewan's 4 years in New Mexico, or the patients who had received wrong medications, or falsified diagnoses or billing statements they had paid because they hadn't known they could contest them. The law could impose consequences. It could not reach backward in time. She knew that. She had known it throughout, and she held it now with the same honesty she had held everything else, not pretending the outcome was complete, and not letting the incompleteness diminish what had been built. A call bell rang somewhere behind her. Her patient in room 4 needed something. She pushed off the wall and straightened and went back to work. But the sentencing hearing for Marsh, Hale, and the other primary defendants took place on a Tuesday in January. Mara attended as a member of the public. She sat in the gallery, not in the front rows. She was not the center of this proceeding, and she didn't need to be. And she watched Judge Patton enter and the courtroom rise and then settle. And she watched the defendants sit at the table where, 14 months earlier, they had entered not guilty pleas with the confident posture of people who expected the machinery to work in their favor. The posture was different now. She noticed that specifically, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular attention she gave to things that were true. Marsh sat with the specific stillness of someone who had already negotiated the terms of the next decade of his life and was now simply waiting for them to be formalized. Hale was looking at the table. The others were managing their expressions with varying degrees of success. Judge Patton delivered the sentences with the measured deliberateness that characterized everything she did. Not theatrical, not performative, simply thorough. Colton Marsh, 16 years federal prison. Restitution of $4.2 million. Victor Hale, 9 years. Restitution of $1.8 million. The billing executives, 4 and 5 years respectively, restitution amounts calculated against their specific documented participation. The board member, 3 years, suspended in part, full restitution. Greg Tully, 18 months federal custody, 3 years supervised release, permanent bar from employment in healthcare administration. Each sentence landed in the courtroom with the silence of something final. Not dramatic silence. The room didn't gasp or murmur. Just the specific quiet of people in a room where important things were being formally resolved. After, Mara did not go to the steps. She went to the lobby, sat on a bench near the doors, and called her mother. "It's done," she said, when her mother answered. Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then, 16 years. For Marsh, yes. And the others. All sentenced, all convicted, all required to pay restitution to the Patient Compensation Fund. Her mother's voice, when it came, had something in it that Mara had not heard from her often. Not relief exactly, but the specific release of something that had been held a very long time under considerable pressure. "Come for Christmas," her mother said. "I'm already planning on it. Bring more than 3 days this time." "5," Mara said. "I'll bring 5." She walked out of the courthouse into a January morning that was clear and cold, the mountains white with snow at the peaks, the city going about its Tuesday around her. She thought about all the things she could think about. There were many of them. She had learned, over the preceding 16 months, to let them exist simultaneously rather than requiring herself to process them in sequence. The gratitude and the anger, the resolution and the things that couldn't be resolved, the pride in what she'd built, and the bone-deep tiredness of what it had cost to build it. She thought about the specific moment, standing in a supply room doorway at 2 in the morning, looking at empty shelves next to a log that said full, and taking out her phone and photographing both. She had not known, in that moment, what she had. She had only known that the gap between what was true and what was recorded was a gap that mattered. She had spent her whole career believing that, believing it with enough conviction to act on it when acting on it was hard, and then harder still. That belief had cost her. She was not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would be its own kind of falsification. And she had devoted 16 months to the project of refusing to falsify things. The stitches had cost her. The months in the motel room had cost her. The nursing license suspension had cost her in a way that the financial settlement could compensate for, but not undo. The sleeplessness and the vigilance and the sustained expenditure of energy that left no margin for anything gentle, all of it had cost her. And she had a life that was hers again. She had work she was good at and a unit she was beginning to know, and patients who came in frightened and left with more information than they'd had, and sometimes with outcomes that were better for her specific attention. She had a mother in Tucson and a colleague named Desmond who ran a floor with actual integrity, and a woman named Becca Strand who was going back to clinical work in Denver, and a man named Marcus Ewan she had heard recently from Odom in discussions about testifying before a federal health oversight committee about the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed everything she'd uncovered to exist for as long as it had. She had built something out of what had been done to her, not because the building made the doing of it acceptable. It didn't. But because she was the kind of person who built things and the raw material had been there and she had used it. One of the young nurses on her unit, a 24-year-old named Priya, who was in her second year and who asked good questions and was not afraid to say when she didn't understand something, had come to Mara 2 weeks earlier with something she'd noticed in a patient's chart. A discrepancy between the documented medication administration and the pharmacy record. Small, potentially explainable. But there. Priya had flagged it quietly, at the end of a shift, not sure if she was seeing something real or inventing a problem. She'd said, with the particular tentativeness of someone who wasn't sure she had the authority to notice things, "I might be wrong. It didn't add up." Mara had looked at the discrepancy. Then she had looked at Priya. "You're not wrong," she said. "And you're not almost wrong either. This needs to go to the pharmacist today, and you need to document that you flagged it with a timestamp." Priya had looked at her with the expression of someone receiving information that was straightforward and also, somehow, more than that. "Does this happen a lot?" Priya asked. "More than it should," Mara said. "Which is why people like you need to keep noticing." She thought about that exchange now, standing in the January cold outside the courthouse. She thought about what it had meant to have someone, early in her own career, tell her that what she was noticing mattered. She hadn't had that person at Harlow. She was determined to be that person somewhere else, for someone who was still building the version of themselves they would need for the hard moments they couldn't yet see coming. That was the part of this she hadn't anticipated when she started. The part that wasn't about Harlow, or the federal case, or the fraudulent billing, or even the patients who had been harmed. The part that was about what you did afterward, with everything you'd learned, when the acute crisis had resolved, and you had to decide what kind of person the experience had made you. She was not a simpler person than she'd been before. She was not untouched, and she was not without costs. She had scars, literal and otherwise. And she had gaps in the preceding 16 months where ordinary life should have been and wasn't. And she would be accounting for those gaps for some time. But she knew things she had not known before. She knew exactly what she was willing to do and how far she would go and what it felt like to go that far and come out the other side still standing. She knew that institutions were made of people and that people made choices and that the choices made inside institutions, accumulated over time, became the institution's character. And that character could be broken open by anyone willing to keep accurate records and refuse to be intimidated into silence. She knew that because she had done it. Imperfectly, expensively, in a motel room under her middle name at 2 a.m. with a bruised rib and 4 stitches in her face. But she had done it. And somewhere right now, in a hospital she didn't know in a state she'd never visited, someone else was standing in a supply room or staring at a billing record or watching a medication order that didn't make clinical sense, and trying to decide whether what they were seeing was real and whether noticing it was worth what noticing it might cost. She wanted that person to know, in whatever way wanting could reach across distances she couldn't cross directly, that the noticing was worth it, that keeping the records mattered, that the machinery of accountability was imperfect and slow and could be compromised, but that it could also be reached, and that one person with clear documentation and enough stubbornness to keep going was not nothing, was in fact more than most institutions expected to face. She looked at the mountains, white and solid and indifferent in the way of things that have been there longer than anything built by people and would be there after all of it had passed. She had always found that fact more stabilizing than diminishing. The sense of being a small thing inside a large permanence, doing the small work that the moment required. Her phone buzzed. A text from Desmond. "Shift starts at 7. You good?" She looked at the text, and something moved in her chest that was simple and real and not complicated by anything. The ordinary human fact of being expected somewhere by someone who ran a good floor and kept honest inventory logs and would tell her directly when she was wrong. She typed back, "I'm good. See you at 7." She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the courthouse behind her one more time, the granite and the symmetry, the civic solemnity of a building that housed, imperfectly and slowly and at enormous human cost, the mechanisms by which things that were wrong were sometimes made to answer for themselves. Then she turned around, and she walked toward everything that was still ahead of her: the floor, the patients, the task force, Priya and her good questions, Becca Strand starting over in Denver, Marcus Ewan going to testify before a federal committee, her mother in Tucson waiting for 5 days in December, and all the thousands of ordinary mornings that were simply hers, which was not a small thing, which was in fact the whole point. She had been dismissed as nothing. She had turned out to be the person who brought it all down. Not because she was extraordinary, though she was, in the specific way that anyone becomes extraordinary when they decide that the true account of events matters more than the comfortable one, and they refuse to let that decision go regardless of the cost. But because she was the kind of person who, when she found a gap between what was true and what was recorded, took out her phone and documented it, and then refused to let anyone take the phone.